Chapter 282. Following the viral spread of the big character poster plan, the overall strength of the Gray Coat Army was increasing at a speed visible to the naked eye every day. Other things aside, this could be seen from the constantly increasing number of soldiers. However, joining the army didn't mean that one could become a qualified soldier. Not to mention that in the Gray Coat Army, many people threw away their farming tools and picked up swords instead. This courage was admirable, but if one didn't have the corresponding survival and killing skills on the battlefield, it would often turn into a tragedy in the end. Not to mention where Borg's idea of a hypothetical war came from. Just this measure alone solved a big problem in the army. While the recruits experienced the cruelty of the battlefield, they also grew rapidly. In the long run, they wouldn't dare to say that they had trained soldiers who had been through hundreds of battles, but at least they wouldn't be afraid to brandish their swords when facing the enemy, not know how to dodge when facing a rain of arrows, and only know how to charge forward when the battle began. The effect was obvious and could be called a good military strategy. However, it was inevitable that there would be winners and losers in a war. The winners naturally deserved to be happy, and there was a chance for promotion and other glory. As for the losers, they could only endure the ridicule of the other party and strive for revenge next time. Of course, this was under the condition that they didn't lose badly. If they were defeated in a complete mess like what was happening right now, with the highest commander personally watching and the command center being wiped out as soon as the battle began, then it would no longer be a simple matter of victory or defeat, but a matter of face, dignity, and other principles. Under such circumstances, the First Army's officer proposed a rematch, which was basically inevitable. Just as he said, in order to prove the strength of the First Army, the battlefield was set up very quickly. Other than leaving a battalion of soldiers, the defeated swordsman regiment had already withdrawn. This officer was originally a regiment commander, so naturally, he directly pulled the big swordsman regiment under him over. As for the Fourth Army, there weren't many casualties previously, and their morale was still high, so the original troops didn't move. Coup! With the sound of a long bugle, the Second War officially began. The formation was set up, and the scouts scattered. This was almost the fixed opening of the battle. Of course, directly disguising themselves like in the gray space didn't count. Haha, they're really careful. Dino looked to the north, the corners of his mouth twitching as if he was mocking them. Everyone knew what General Dino meant. After the big sword regiment in the north spread out, the scouts didn't scout far away. Instead, they carefully combed through the surroundings. Although it was reasonable to say that no matter how good the plan was, it was unlikely to be used a second time so quickly. However, the officer clearly did not dare to underestimate the wretchedness of the members of the Gray Space. He still carefully checked the surroundings. People who had nothing to do with it, such as the healers, were also invited outside the battlefield. Daniel snorted coldly. He did not continue this topic that was obviously asking for humiliation. Compared to the cautious soldiers in the north, the Spear Regiment of the Fourth Army was much bolder. After the scouts explored half of the battlefield, the Spear Regiment of the Fourth Army directly piled up all the soldiers in the middle and then slowly advanced forward. Now, what kind of formation is this? Some officers were surprised. Borg, who was next to him, frowned. If the terrain is flat, this should be a regular square formation. But now, as he looked at the pikemen who were scattered because of the winding mountain path and the complicated and ever-changing terrain, he sighed with emotion. They really look like a swarm of bees. Hi, you're right. But what's their purpose in doing this? As the saying goes, there must be something wrong when things are abnormal. The Spear Regiment's strange formation subconsciously made people feel that something was wrong. There's no point in guessing now. Maybe they'll change their formation later, right? Where are the members of the Gray Space? As they chatted for a while, an officer sensitively asked this question. Now, no one dared to ignore this team that did not play by the rules. The Spear Regiment had more than 1,000 people in front of them. Among them was the Spear Formation breaking team. However, the members of the Gray Space were nowhere to be seen as usual. Don't tell me they went to the Swordsman Regiment's command center again? Someone joked, "Huh, that's impossible. They should be hiding somewhere, holding back their evil intentions. No matter what, I want to see what tricks they can play in a direct battle." Without a doubt, this was the first army. Not only them, but even Omen, Daniel, and Dana in front of them were interested in this question. However, no matter how they observed, they could not find the dozens of members of the gray space. Therefore, they were looking forward to what was about to happen. Of course, Daniel hoped that they would be self-defeating. Tang In smiled at this time. What others could not see did not mean that he could not see. In fact, he had already observed most of the members of the gray space. At this time, they had divided into small teams of 4 or 5 people and were moving forward in a net. So that's how it is. Tang In vaguely understood David and Michaud's intentions and could not help but nod. At the same time, he was a little nervous. This kind of combat method was what he had always wanted to achieve. He had done a lot of targeted training. Now it was time to see the actual effect. The corner of his clothes was tugged. "Brother Tang In, is there someone hiding there?" Little Carol asked with a crisp voice and an outstretched finger. Tang In was stunned and looked into the distance. Some people around also heard it, and their hearts skipped a beat. However, following Little Carol's finger, they only saw bare hills and scattered stones. There was no one at all. Yes. Tang In nodded and chuckled. "It's a fat white pig." Up. Little Carol tilted her head in confusion, her face adorable. Huh. The nervous people around couldn't help but relax. They shook their heads and laughed at themselves for being too nervous. Then, they looked at Tang In and didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Was he teasing a child? Then wouldn't the big white rabbit be better? "Can you tell me how you saw him?" Tang In picked up Little Carol and asked softly. Little Carol blinked. "I just saw him. He was moving before." "Oh, he's moving again." Tang In nodded, then narrowed his eyes and looked at the stone on the top of the hill in the distance, slowly moving to the side. "That's Harry." "Well, can you see anything else?" Tang In asked tentatively. Little Carol turned her little head and scanned around. "Then I'll take a look." "Hey, there's movement. There seems to be one hidden." "Here too, there too." The people around them no longer paid attention to the two of them, who seemed to be playing some kind of childish game, so they didn't see the unconcealed shock on Tang In's face. Tang In was indeed shocked. The places Little Carol had pointed out were where the members of the gray space were hiding. Tang In had taught the gray space's concealment skills, so he could easily see all kinds of clues at a glance. But how did Little Carol see through them? It had to be pointed out that she spent most of her time improving her strength, speed, and other basics. At most, she would add the use of the scythe. He hadn't taught her concealment skills yet. After the initial shock, Tang In quickly discovered the key. Little Carol seemed to be very sensitive to things that suddenly moved. Like a leaf that had fallen to the ground, no one would pay attention to it. But when the breeze blew and the leaves started to flutter, Little Carol would immediately notice them. She would notice that they only moved suddenly. If they stayed still, she wouldn't notice. It was just like how she had noticed the moving Luke, but hadn't noticed the camouflaged Michaud a few meters away from Luke. This size could be considered a talent. Tang In rubbed his chin. Well, at the very least, when he set up a stall to sell things, he basically didn't have to worry about being stolen. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 283. Naturally, he was joking when he said that he was watching a stall. The so-called talent was more outstanding than ordinary people in the same aspect. If it was discovered and consciously nurtured, it would definitely shine brightly. Luke's eagle-like eyes were like that. He was now practically a fixed scout and long-range sniper in the gray space. Little Carol's talent was different from his. For the time being, Tang In couldn't figure out what it was used for, but he believed that the old butler would take care of everything. After this interlude, the spear regiment at the foot of the mountain was already close to the center of the battlefield. The swordsman regiment had wasted some time investigating the surroundings earlier, so it hadn't been long since they set off. However, their scouts had already seen the spear regiment. They're still not changing their formation? Even the officer of the Fourth Army was a little confused because the spear regiment was still in a messy swarm formation. What are they planning? What other ideas can they have at a time like this? Said the officer of the First Army disdainfully. I think they're overconfident because of their small victory last time. Thinking about how they had won the first round so cleanly, someone nodded. If that's the case, it really is possible. General Dina's lips twitched when he heard that, but he didn't turn around and scold them, because even he couldn't understand what his men were doing. In a battle of thousands of people, it was necessary to set up a battle formation. Choosing a suitable formation could even reverse the entire situation. But this swarm in front of him, damn, did I teach you that? As for changing the formation at the last minute, that was nonsense. War wasn't a game of flags. When the other side arrived, they could adjust their strategy on the spur of the moment. On a real battlefield, it wasn't impossible to change the formation, but there had to be ample preparation and room to relax. The spear regiment was already close to the middle, and the mountain roads weren't very wide. What was there to change? Dina slammed his palm and frowned, his breathing ragged. Were these brats really out of their minds? Compared with the anxious Dina, Daniel wasn't very relaxed at that moment either. It wasn't that he didn't notice the other party's foolish move, but he had been through many battles and was no longer easily swayed by external factors. Right now, he only cared about the outcome of the battle. Although it was said that the strength of the four armies was similar, those who knew the inside story knew that the First Army was the strongest. As the First Army's commander-in-chief, Daniel naturally knew this as well. This was glory, but it was also pressure. However, Daniel did not care. He was even willing to admit this fact to his face, because in his opinion, this was only natural. The so-called First Army would always be number one. The anti-Japanese war was not a real war, but in the current situation, it was the only stage for them to compete. In the recent battles, the First Army had a pretty good winning rate. They had 10 wins and 2 losses and were ranked first. Oh, now, it's 3 losses. Although they were at the top of the list, all the officers in the First Army had a thorn in their hearts, because those 3 losses were all to the same opponent, the Fourth Army's Long Spear Regiment. This time, Daniel had also spoken up when he suggested another battle. It could be said that this was an opportunity that he had earned by swallowing his pride. Although it was only a battle between one regiment, judging from the current atmosphere, it was also a battle between the First Army and the Fourth Army that had been in the limelight recently. They could only win, not lose. But Daniel exhaled slightly. Now, whenever he thought of the gray space, his heart would feel a little uneasy. Naturally, his vision was not comparable to the officers behind him. In his opinion, the gray space was the biggest variable in this battle. The Long Spear Regiment was strong, but after all, it was still within the rules of the battlefield. This time, the officer on his side led the Big Sword Regiment, which was an elite unit. As long as the strategy was right, there was still a high chance of winning. However, everything was different after the gray space joined the battle. Although the previous battle was almost an absurd attack on the command post, everything was different. From this, it could be seen that this was not a team that was satisfied with the rules. There were only 2 outcomes. Either they overreached themselves, or they shocked the world with a single brilliant feat. Just as the 2 generals were thinking about it, a low voice suddenly sounded. The Swordsman Regiment is moving. Hearing this, everyone turned their attention to the north. After the First Army Swordsman Regiment received the report from the scout, the long snake formation that was originally used for traveling quickly changed. The soldiers in the front stayed in place, while the soldiers behind spread out and moved forward, forming 2 wings. Their movements were swift and their tactics clear. It was the style of the First Army's elite unit. They are going to surround them. Board whispered. Hearing this, the officers nodded. This strategy was correct. Although they did not know what the Long Spear Regiment was up to, now that they knew the number of people on both sides, there was no need to worry about an ambush. Since the enemy was rushing over like a swarm of bees, the most basic and effective strategy was to surround and annihilate them. After the formation was formed, the Swordsman Regiment advanced as a whole, especially the 2 wings, and sped up to encircle them. However, the Long Spear Regiment maintained their original formation and moved forward unhurriedly. Matherf asterisk Kerr, quickly change. The officers of the Fourth Army were anxious. They could not wait to reach out and squeeze the soldiers below into a different formation. It's over. This Long Spear Regiment, sigh. Everything was understood without words. The neutral officers of the Tactics Department shook their heads. Obviously, they were not optimistic. The result is set. The First Army was naturally happy. It was as if they could see the beautiful future of defeating the Long Spear Regiment for the first time. What a joke. Do you think that the spear formation breaking team can sweep through everything? And that gray space. Other than playing tricks, what else can they do? It was obvious that victory was in their hands. The officers of the First Army could not bear the loneliness anymore. They all spoke to tease the officers of the Fourth Army. Matherf asterisk Kerr, the result is not out yet. Why are you so arrogant? That's right. When the tables turn, let's see how you will shed horse piss, tears. It had to be said that like soldiers. Dina's subordinates, who had a boorish personality, were also a group of boorish officers. As soon as they opened their mouths, slang from all over the world immediately came out. Although these words seemed to be more forceful and did not have much impact, they still had to maintain their attitude. However, he still had to show his attitude. This was called losing the battle, but not losing the battle. With this scolding, the First Army could not take it anymore. They were all men in the army. Even if they did not know anything else, they knew how to scold people. The scolding war instantly escalated. Personal attacks were thrown everywhere. Old Marshal Omeng, who was in front, did not care about this. He was still searching for traces of the gray space. He did not believe that this group of people would not do anything. They were enduring now just to wait for the eruption. Since Omeng did not care, Dina and Daniel naturally would not stop them. What kind of joke was this? Even if they stopped, the other party had to stop first. There was only to talk about Tang Yin, not to mention whether he would do such a thankless task. Even if he did, the officers on both sides would not listen to him. At this moment, an uncertain voice was heard amidst the chaotic scolding. Did you guys notice the scout seems to have disappeared? With your shifty look, I'm a scout? Are you talking about me? Why don't you look at your nose? If it wasn't hanging on your face, I would have suspected that you're a scout. A scout. The scout has disappeared. Which scout? As the questions continued to be asked, the scolding finally subsided. Everyone first looked at Borg, then looked down at the crowd below. The one who had spoken earlier was Borg. If there was anyone who was most optimistic about the gray space, it was undoubtedly Borg. This was a rather strange phenomenon. Borg naturally did not have a good impression of the gray space, but he was very confident in Tang Yin. Or more accurately, he was the one who was most afraid of him. He had been in contact with Tang Yin for too long, so he knew very well what kind of incredible ability this ordinary-looking, inconspicuous young man had. Based on this mentality, even though the Long Spear Regiment was at an absolute disadvantage, Borg still kept observing every movement around him. Finally, he found that the scouts sent by the First Army for investigation and communication had all disappeared without him noticing. This was undoubtedly a strange situation. Although the scouts running around in the continuous hills looked like little wild rabbits from above, no one paid attention to them. However, when all the wild rabbits disappeared collectively in broad daylight, and under everyone's nose, it was inevitable that they would feel a chill in their hearts. Gray space. This was the first thought that popped up in everyone's mind, and they quickly confirmed it. This style was indeed unique to the gray space. Had they finally made a move, the officers of the Fourth Army did not have time to celebrate, and the officers of the First Army did not have time to panic. They were now thinking about the intention of this move. Killing the scouts was the most common scene in war. No matter which army it was, they did not like to have such a pair of surveillance eyes around them. But here, did it have any decisive effect? No matter how many scouts there were, how many could there be? Could it be that they could kill an extra battalion of soldiers? No. The officers quickly turned away from such thoughts and thought about it from another angle. If it was not purely to reduce the number of people, then this could only mean that the scouts had effected something. If this was the case, what they were going to do next was the key. Currently, there were officers of the combat department, senior officers of the 1st Army, and the 4th Army here. It could be said that there were people who came up with plans and strategies and led troops to fight. To be able to get to this level, they were naturally very sensitive to the battlefield. After thinking for a while and coming up with this possibility, everyone stared down below. At this moment, in the middle road at the foot of the mountain, the soldiers in the middle of the Long Spear Regiment and the Swordsman Regiment were very close. And at most 10 minutes, after going around the middle of the hill, the two sides would meet face to face. There, at the top of the hill, a hurried voice sounded. Everyone did not have time to look at the person who stretched out his arm and turned their heads to the side. It was the outermost left wing of the Swordsman Regiment. A 100-man brigade was advancing at high speed. Their mission was to go around the enemy's back and form the final encirclement with the soldiers coming from the right wing. However, at a corner of the hill, the stones on the side of the road suddenly flew up and landed in the middle of the troops. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 284. Who would care about a rock on the side of the road? No one. If it weren't for the dozens of pairs of eyes on the mountaintop scanning the area below, and one of them happened to see this, the flying rock wouldn't have been discovered. By the time everyone turned their heads, the rock had already stretched its body in the air and landed in the middle of the Swordsman Brigade. Needless to say, the soldiers were also stunned. Only a small portion of the surrounding people were stunned. Most of them were still hurrying on. Bang! The shadow of the stick flew out and fell down with a thud. After the rock cut into the middle of the team, it didn't hesitate to swing a wooden stick as thick as an arm and hit a soldier on the head. The other party also gave it face. His head tilted and he fell down. Without waiting for the body to hit the ground, the rock picked up the person and rushed out. The formation of the rushing team was naturally not neat. After the rock rushed out a few steps along the gap, the surrounding soldiers reacted. But before they could wave their swords and shout a warning, another rock behind them also jumped up, bumping into people, swinging the stick, attacking all in one go. The crowd that had just gathered was immediately split into two sides. The rock that had rushed in to capture the person trotted out along the passage. After that, the two rocks ran toward the low mound. Perhaps because they thought it was too heavy or something else, they peeled off the gray rock skin on their bodies as they ran. When they reached the top of the mountain, two black-armored figures appeared in front of everyone and then disappeared from the back of the mountain. The furious soldiers chased after them. Brother Harry? Brother David? Little Carol raised her head and blinked her bright eyes. Yes, Tang and nodded silently. The whole process took less than 10 seconds, but everyone on the mountaintop was stunned for at least 30 seconds. This... Daniel opened his mouth like a fish that lacked oxygen on land. In the end, he didn't say anything. What does this mean? Everyone knew what General Daniel wanted to say, because this was what they were considering now. There was no doubt that those two people were from the gray space. But, okay, your disguises are awesome and your movements are nimble enough, but it's just to capture a person. What do you mean by mobilizing so many people? Before everyone could habitually start thinking, another voice sounded, and it was coherent. Over there. There's one here, too. This is also... The previous operation was like a bugle horn, and the two wings of the Swordsman Regiment instantly fell into a burst of chaos. Stones, turf, ground, tree holes, all kind of camouflage, all kinds of people. Some of them rushed in to snatch the loot like before. Some of them hung ropes from the trees and easily tied them up. The most tragic one was the person running at the front of the group. He was directly hit by a tree trunk and fell into a ditch by the roadside. Then, a member of the gray space opened a gunny sack and packed it up to carry it away. Of course, he didn't succeed every time. However, even if they couldn't take him away, the members of the gray space would find a way to knock him out and then retreat. In just a few minutes, the people on the mountain peak were dazzled and unable to take their eyes off of it. This efficiency, this creativity, not only was it professional, but it was also professional. The officers looked at Tang, on with strange expressions. Was this really a gray space? Had the bandits from the city, who specialized in kidnapping and extortion, snuck in? The effect of a few minutes of captivity was huge. On both sides of the hills, the soldiers of the swordsman regiment were chasing after them. However, it was obvious that the speed of the members of the gray space was absolutely first class. They used all kinds of methods to climb, run, and jump. The soldiers tried to intercept them many times, but in the end, they could only eat dust behind them. At this time, the people on the mountain peak looked at Tang In again. They thought of the training of the gray space in the past, and thought of how Tang In directly stepped on the mountain wall not long ago. So this was the team's specialty. After a few complaints, the officers withdrew their thoughts. At this time, they were even more confused. According to the current situation, it was obvious that the important action of the gray space was to capture people. However, what was the purpose of this? Could it be to destroy the encirclement formation? This was the most likely answer that everyone thought of. At present, the formation of the soldiers on the two wings of the swordsman regiment was indeed chaotic. The soldiers were like wild animals running all over the mountain when a tiger was hunting. A group in the east, a group in the west. But this effect was not big. The officers frowned. With such an obvious purpose, the leaders of the swordsman regiment were not fools. Besides, even if they didn't realize this, they would definitely give up when they couldn't catch up with the people. Then, they would regroup and rush to the predetermined encirclement location. Yes, that might delay some time and affect the battle. But in fact, the impact was minimal. Although the number of soldiers in the middle of the swordsman regiment was less than the number of soldiers in the spear regiment, they would still be able to hold on for a few minutes. However, if this was the case, the gray space this time, overreaching themselves? An officer of the First Army said thoughtfully. There was silence, and then everyone looked at each other with complicated expressions. The officers of the First Army were naturally excited. The more they thought about it, the more likely it was. Yes, after all, the members of the gray space had not experienced a real battlefield and did not understand some things. Naturally, they would take it for granted. Just like now, they must have thought that as long as they angered the swordsman regiment, the other side would play with them forever. But in fact, they did not know that after receiving the military deployment from the higher-ups, the officers at all levels would complete the task to the letter, especially when this was the elite swordsman regiment of the First Army. What the officers of the First Army thought of, the others naturally also thought of. The officers of the Fourth Army looked gloomy and sighed in their hearts. Resentment? Not really. After all, the members of the gray space really did not understand military affairs. Sigh, it seemed like they were going to lose this time. The officers of the First Army laughed when they saw the expression on the other side's face. But before they could laugh out loud, everyone turned and saw General Daniel's gloomy face, coupled with the cold snort just now. It was obvious that he was in a bad mood. They looked at General Dina on the other side, who was stroking his black beard calmly and smiling so widely that the corners of his mouth almost reached his ears. In the middle, old Marshal Omeng turned and patted Tang In on the shoulder with a look of admiration. What was going on? Looking at the completely opposite attitude in front of them, the officers were stunned. Could it be that things were not as they thought? Idiot! Daniel looked at his stunned subordinates and seemed to be even angrier. The corners of his eyes twitched, and his tone was furious. You still don't understand? Think about why the regiment commander of the Spear Regiment agreed to this. Is he as stupid as you? You guys? General Dina also spoke at this time. He pointed at his subordinates, but did not scold them. Instead, he had a very annoying smile on his face. You have to trust the judgment of your comrades. The regiment commander of the Spear Regiment? Everyone was stunned for a moment before they reacted. If the regiment commander of the Spear Regiment was not blinded by victory, then the reason why he used a swarm formation was because he knew that the enemy would choose to surround them from both sides. In that case, he also knew about the gray space's operation. That's not right. The gray space can't hold back the two sides now. Oh wait, all the officers felt their scalps go numb, as if a wave of cold water had swept past them. If the regiment commander of the Spear Regiment knew about the Gray Space's operation, then with his eyesight, how could he not see that it was impossible to succeed? If he still chose to do this, the only explanation would be that this tactic could succeed. Were we wrong? But where exactly were we wrong? The regiment commander of the Spear Regiment, the scout, it was Borg again. He had a look of disbelief as he swallowed his saliva with difficulty. Could it be that the people they kidnapped were the leaders of each swordsman team? Silence. Silence. Dead silence. Omeng raised his eyebrows and then turned around with a smile. He nodded and said admiringly, "Not bad, not bad. You're good at leading soldiers." Borg's face was full of flattery and pride. He straightened his body and gave a standard military salute. It was not easy to receive such praise from old Marshal Omeng. However, Borg's heart was still a little complicated. On one hand, he could guess at first because of his unique talent and tactics. On the other hand, the most important thing was that he was too afraid of Tang In and too confident in him. Unlike other people's complicated thoughts, his first thought was to find the reason from the gray space. That was why he made such a bold guess. On the side, the officers' faces were burning as if they had been slapped hard in the face. They finally understood why the commander of the Spear Regiment agreed to do this. As long as the members of the Gray Space successfully kidnapped the low-ranking captains of the two flanks, then the rest of the soldiers would be like headless flies. This wasn't an exaggeration. If the one who was kidnapped was the commander, then the battalion commanders would discuss and recommend someone to take over the command. If the battalion commanders were kidnapped, then the brigade commanders should be able to continue to lead the troops. They all had a certain level of military literacy. However, to kidnap the leaders of each troop. Ugh, did you want the soldiers to think like an officer? The officers could almost see the following situation. The soldiers of the big swordsman regiment in the middle would fall into a difficult battle after receiving no reinforcements. At this time, the regiment commander would definitely send someone to urge the wings, but he would find that there was not a single scout around him. At this time, the soldiers on the two sides would either continue to chase or stand in a daze, waiting for orders. Then, the swordsman regiment in the middle would be defeated by the spear regiment, who had the advantage in numbers. In the end, they would be beaten up all over the mountains and plains, scratching their heads. Most of the officers squatted down. Too ruthless. This move is too ruthless. If the Gray Space took over the command post in the first battle by decapitation, then this was undoubtedly a severing of the meridians. Without the meridians connected to each other, the wings would not be able to move at all. Moreover, this style of killing with one blow was clearly an extremely brilliant tactic. To think that they had mocked them for not knowing any tactics, for taking things for granted, where's the crack in the ground? Where's the crack in the ground? I want to crawl into it. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 285. The afternoon sun shone through the dark gray city walls and illuminated a large area of the encampment. Of the 4 seasons, winter was the coldest, especially in the north. However, the winter afternoon sun here was also the most comfortable. It was warm but not dry. When it shone on one's body, it would make one feel lazy and then have the urge to take a nap. Borg's head was dizzy now. Of course, this was not because he wanted to sleep. He was thinking about something, and his emotions were complicated. So much so that he ignored the people who greeted him from afar. Due to the extraordinary performance of a certain team, or rather, the disruption, the 2 battles in the morning had already ended. The outcome was self-evident. The 4th Army's Long Spear Regiment had won. If it were not for the small conflict between the officers of the 2 armies and old Marshal Omeng's reprimand, he could even make it home for lunch. To be honest, the 2 battles that evolved into a battle between the 2 armies did not have much to do with him. Perhaps the only thing that could be considered a reward was the verbal praise he received from old Marshal Omeng. This was not easy and was very rare. However, Borg was still not in a good mood. He was a little confused and lost, and there was also a little fear that he did not want to face directly in his heart. To what extent could a person's bravery reach to fight 10 or 100 people? After all, there was an end and a limit. Only by controlling tens of thousands of people and horses, by waving one's hand and causing the earth to tremble and the sky to tremble, could one have true power. This was what his father had said, and also what Bord was striving for. However, after watching the two battles, this unwavering goal seemed a little unrealistic. Bord did not have a good impression of Tang An. It could even be said that he hated him. This was for sure. There were many reasons for this. His strength was not as good as Tang An's. His family was injured and helpless, and his beloved woman also liked him. It could be said that as a man, in this world where the strong were respected, Borg had been beaten black and blue. Even so, Borg still did not give up. In terms of strength, Borg knew that there was no hope. Along the way, he knew better than anyone else how fast Tang An's strength grew. However, he also had his own advantages, and that was his unique talent in tactics. Recently, he had also put in a lot of effort to learn from Old Meng and had benefited a lot. He had originally thought that when he grew into a general of an army, he would be able to look down on the other party and prove to Josiah who was the strongest. But now, Tang An had appeared with the gray space. To be honest, although Borg was very optimistic about the gray space before, that was in other fields. In his heart, he also felt that this team was not suitable to survive on the battlefield. But the reality was that these few dozen people had toyed with an entire regiment of soldiers in the palm of their hands. What if the scale of the gray space becomes larger in the future? If his strength continued to grow, by the time he gained control of an army of thousands of men and horses, would the other party be able to easily defeat him? Phew! Borg shook his head and let out a long sigh before walking through the gate of the family gathering place. The Gray Coat Army did not have any special privileges. Their leader, Losha, only lived in an ordinary house. However, there were too many people in the Elvis family that Borg belonged to, so they had to separate a place for them to live. It was not big, but one could tell that it was different from the other buildings in the encampment. The most obvious one was the front yard that one could see after passing through the gate. The habit of ordinary people was to build a yard behind their house to dry their clothes or to rear some poultry. In the corner of the front yard, there were a few potted plants. Although they were just ordinary flowers and plants, looking at them swaying gently in the wind still gave one a sense of elegance. If it was the manner in the past, there should be master-level sculptures placed there. Borg shook his head with a complicated expression and walked to the front hall. His mind began to churn again. That's right. I used to be a noble. Why didn't I learn etiquette and sword skills? Why can't I win against a peasant now? I can't understand. And that Josiah, he's a noble. He should be used to such a lifestyle and like people in this circle. But why is he always so calm towards me? I can't understand. Is it because I'm not a noble now? No, I'm thinking too much. That Philip guy didn't succeed, either. Borg patted his forehead lightly and forcibly dispelled the meaningless thoughts in his mind. The gray space was just a trick this time. If it was a real battlefield, how could they destroy the command post so easily and capture all the officers? My path is right. Why doesn't Josiah like me? Where am I lacking? Don't think about this. Oh, Borg suddenly hugged his head and squatted in front of the front hall. He opened his mouth wide and screamed silently. His ferocious face and dejected movements made him look extremely dejected. This is an opportunity. After the city propaganda plan is launched, it's imperative to establish a secret contact point in the city. Enoch, fight for the leadership of this organization. I'm fine with it, but brother, this involves intelligence. It's very sensitive. Because of this, we need it even more. That's true. This place wasn't very useful before, so Luosa has been in charge of it. Now that there are so many things going on in the encampment, she can't be distracted. So, we need to find someone who is directly responsible to her. Now, our problem is how to squeeze out the others. Understood. Who else is there? A few unrelated people. Haha. Mainly those fellows standing behind them who think they have the seniority. Come to think of it, it's funny. Originally, their life was just to reclaim farmland, but now they want to desperately grab power. They really don't know what they're talking about. If it wasn't for the importance of this position, I really want to give it to them and see how they manage such a huge organization like a vegetable garden. Huh, what a waste of this opportunity to see a joke. There will be more in the future. By the way, there's one more person who is more troublesome. Who? Josiah. Borg, who was outside the room, had already calmed down. Although he heard some of the conversation in the room, he naturally didn't think too much about it. When he was about to reach out and knock on the door, he was stunned by the sudden appearance of Josiah. Josiah. After a pause, the voice in the room sounded again. Isn't she in the publicity department? Why is she fighting for this position? Oh, it's Father and Uncle Enoch. Borg nodded, and then he couldn't help but wonder why they were talking about Josiah. It should be Rose's idea. She's different from those shallow old guys. It's impossible that she doesn't understand the importance of this position. She just wants to find someone she can trust more. Rosa doesn't trust us? Not to that extent. We're in the same boat now. And even if she doesn't trust us, Rosa won't be stingy with what she deserves from our family. Haha, she's a smart person. She knows our important role. You're right. But this is difficult. The city publicity plan was originally Josiah's idea, not to mention that she participated in it personally. She should have gotten the approval of some of the old guys if she joined the competition. That's for sure. Sigh, it's strange. This Josiah, right, and that guy called Tang in. When they joined, I wasn't in the station, so I lost the opportunity to make friends with them. In the end, when I came back, one of them became Rose's people, and the other became our potential enemy. It's really, sigh, yeah, it's a pity. If we had them, our family's position in the Gray Coat Army would be completely consolidated. Tang in again, Tang in again. Borg's breathing became heavier, and he clenched his fists. He wished that Tang in was in his hands, and he could crush him directly. Borg originally came here hoping to get some words of encouragement from his father, but now he heard high praise for Tang in. Naturally, he was depressed. There was a moment of silence in the room, and then Enoch's voice sounded again. But it's not like there's no chance. Isn't Borg pursuing Josiah now? Yeah, but the chance is not big. Bosco sighed in the room. Borg, he sighed. That Josiah seems to have a better impression of Tang. This Tang in again? Yes, but such a result is not surprising. Josiah knew Tang in before Borg, and later this Tang in repeatedly made great contributions. Which woman in this period doesn't love heroes who turn the tide? Makes sense. Damn it. Borg couldn't listen anymore. He suddenly turned around and left with red eyes and a conflicted face. Borg, who was full of anger and unwillingness, did not notice that just as he walked out of the door of the back hall opened a crack, and a slightly gloomy face squinted at his back. Needless to say, this should be Borg's third uncle, Enoch. Ha, he looks very angry. Chuckling, Enoch turned his head and said, Brother, isn't this a bit too exciting? Recently, Borg has been working hard, and I heard that Omeng has a good opinion of him. Not enough. Bosco, who was standing in the middle of the front hall, was expressionless. Now it's different from before. Even if it's us, one wrong step will send us straight into the abyss. And now the family is being rebuilt, and we will grow old eventually. If he can't grow up quickly and take on the responsibility of the eldest son, the family will never have a future. Enoch nodded silently to show his agreement. Of course, he knew that if a family wanted to develop, the first 3 generations were the most important. Just like a building, if the foundation couldn't be consolidated, even if the next generation had incredible figures, it would take a lot of effort to make it stand. Let's go. Bosco flicked his black-rimmed top hat and put it on as he walked to the door. Come with me to visit those old guys. Well, I hope it won't take too long. I hate the tasteless decorations and strange smells in those vegetable farmers' houses. Yes. Enoch opened the door and laughed at himself. Who asked them to have the vegetables we need in their hands now? P.S. Sorry, I only have 1 chapter today, and I'll make up the rest tomorrow. There's a power outage at home, and this is from an internet cafe more than 10 miles away. Sigh, I really want to complain. The few people beside me should be middle school students playing LOL. That voice, that posture, he's just like a proper military commander. Young people, work hard. Earth's future resistance against aliens depends on you. Nonsense is free. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 286. After running out of the gate, Borg avoided anyone he saw and turned when he came across a road. He ran for a long time with an empty mind and finally found a corner that was temporarily empty. Bosco also knew about the battle in the morning, so they thought it was exciting, but when it came to Borg, he almost had a mental breakdown. There were a lot of stone slabs and logs piled up around this corner, which should be used to repair the city wall in the future, but now it had become the object for Borg to vent his anger. Bang, 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 wood chips flew everywhere, and green light burst out continuously. The power of mid-level combat energy was not small, so soon the top log was blasted with many fist holes. Then it broke and rolled down. Borg's hoarse roar contained all kinds of anger and unwillingness. He had completely lost his mind now and only knew how to constantly activate his combat energy, so he did not see what was under the log at all. Bang, crack. With a blood-curdling scream, Borg held his bloody fist and retreated in a sorry state. There was a piece of black-gray rock where some of its surface had collapsed and was replaced by spots of blood. This was the main rock used to build the city gate, so it was naturally very hard. Even if he used his combat energy, he could not damage it with just his fist. At least Borg could not. Damn it. Borg stepped forward, jumped up with a conflicted face, and stomped down fiercely. Bang, bang, bang. Green light covered it, and stone powder flew everywhere. Hoo-hoo! When Borg stepped back, pulled his clothes and neck, and gasped for breath, the black-gray rock was still standing firm. Although this result was disheartening, Borg had at least regained some of his rationality. There are two most direct ways for a frustrated man to temporarily calm down. One was wine, and the other was women. The former could be anesthetic, and the latter could be soothing. The latter was, of course, impossible, as no one in the Gray Coat Army was engaged in this profession. So, running hundreds of miles to find a village girl? Even if the village girl agreed, Borg, who had some sense, would not do so. The main reason for this was not that he despised her. After all, there were also handsome birds in the deep mountains. It was just that as the eldest son, Borg had been instilled with the importance of noble blood since he was very young, and there were no good contraceptives these days. He was not a noble now, so if something happened, it would be hard to clean up his mess. Thinking of this, he could only find someone to drink with. Borg stood there for a while and took out a handkerchief to wipe the blood on his fist. Then he used what little rationality he had left to think about his drinking buddies. He turned around and strode away. On the other hand, Tang In, who had caused Borg to be extremely conflicted, was in a good mood. Among them, destroying the command system of the 1st Army Swordsman Regiment was secondary. What Tang In was most happy about was that the Gray Space Team was finally taking shape. To be honest, Tang In, who had transmigrated from the modern world, did not intend to turn the Gray Space into a special force. His wish was very simple. He wanted his members to work together and form a team of assassins that knew how to cooperate well. But now, reality had given him even more surprises. If I improve a little more, I'll have more help when I assassinate Sessman. Tang In narrowed his eyes and looked into the distance. He only hoped that it wouldn't come too late. After a while, Tang In shook his head and continued to walk to the back of the station. Not long ago, after saying goodbye to Fry and the others, little Carol went to train with the Gray Space members. As for Tang In, of course, he was not going back to the cabin. He was going to invite a great god, a god who could improve the strength of David and the others. It had to be said that the conversation with the old butler on the way back had made Tang Un's mind a lot more flexible. Since the system's skills could be taught, why not invite someone who knew how to use combat energy as an assistant? Although Tang In's strength was not low, what he learned was completely different from David and the others. He could teach combat awareness and skills, but when it came to using combat energy and breaking through bottlenecks, he was completely an amateur. Since he had decided to invite someone, Tang Un was determined to invite the best, who had the highest combat energy in the station, Zhuo Fan. But there was a problem. How could he get Zhuo Fan to agree? This was very troublesome because Tang In and Zhuo Fan had no friendship at all. Well, according to observation, except for Losha, Zhuo Fan had no friendship with anyone in the station. Could it be that he had to ask Losha for help? Tang In pinched his chin and decisively pushed this idea to the back of his mind. Tang In knew Losha's personality very well. If she could ask you for help for nothing, asking her for help now was like asking for a gun. She might have to agree to a bunch of conditions. Well, this would be the last resort. If there was no other way, he could try. As the saying goes, if you want to take, you must first give. This sentence meant that if you wanted to get something from someone else, you must first give something. But Zhuo Fan, Tang In scratched his head. What did he want? Money? Power? Women? Definitely not. For someone like Zhuo Fan who had one foot in the Void Realm, if he declared his loyalty to a noble, he would definitely not lack these things. But now that he had joined the Grey Coat Army, it was clear that he did not care. After thinking for a while, Tang In realized that the only thing he could offer was the combat chi circulation channel. But this thing could not be exposed. It could be used to fool the weak David and the others. But if this thing appeared in front of Zhuo Fan, he would definitely be able to see its value and significance. It was not about whether he trusted Zhuo Fan or not, but this thing was too important. Twain did not want to live the rest of his life in fear, and once exposed, even if it was unintentional, even if it was accidentally exposed, there would be no place for him in the world. Forget it, I'll just play it by ear. Since he could not think of a good idea, Tang In slapped his forehead and threw away his random thoughts. As usual, Zhuo Fan stayed close to Rose's house. This was probably for better protection. After joining the Grey Coat Army for so long, Tang In already knew why Losha was still alive despite having such a high bounty. It was clearly because of Zhuo Fan. To be honest, Tang In was also a bit curious why Zhuo Fan joined the Grey Coat Army. Even if he had a calm personality and did not like fame and wealth, there was no need for him to go on the path of rebellion. Also, he was a Void Realm warrior. Although Tang In did not know how many Void Realm warriors there were in the brand, he knew that people who had reached this realm did not like to move around. They all cultivated bitterly in order to see the mysteries of the higher realms. People like Zhuo Fan, who followed the Grey Coat Army around, were definitely different. Thinking of this, Tang In went to Zhuo Fan's house. It was very ordinary. There was no yard. It was just built with common wood, just like the owner who did not have any sense of presence. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Knock, knock, knock. Tang In knew that people at Zhuo Fan's realm were very sensitive to external things. He guessed that Zhuo Fan would know when he came to the door. However, knocking on the door was a sign of politeness. Creak, the wooden door opened. Zhuo Fan stood behind the door with a simple face. He did not know if it was because of Zhuo Fan's calm gaze or because he had a request, but Tang In suddenly felt a bit uncomfortable. He rubbed his nose and said, good afternoon. Zhuo Fan nodded and turned to enter the house. Tang In paused for a moment, then understood and followed in. If it was someone who was not familiar with Zhuo Fan, they would definitely think that Zhuo Fan was impolite. However, Tang In remembered Losha's evaluation of Zhuo Fan. He could not help but think that Zhuo Fan really did not like to talk. If the outside of the house was ordinary, then the inside of the house was even more simple. A bare hardwood bed, a low table, and a black ceramic tea set were all gone. Was he a monk? He did not even have a blanket. Tang In suddenly felt a lot of pressure. What would a person like this need? Zhuo Fan seemed to like to sit quietly. He came to the table and looked at Tang In. Although there were 2 teacups on the table, he did not seem to have any intention of inviting him to drink tea. Ahem. After clearing his throat, Tang In decided to get straight to the point. I would like to ask for your help. Teach those brats from the gray space about fighting aura. Zhuo Fan did not speak, but a trace of doubt flashed through his eyes. Tang In quickly understood. He rubbed his nose and said, my situation is a bit special. I cannot teach them about fighting aura. Although his words were vague, Zwafan was not someone who wanted to get to the bottom of things. He nodded and took a sip from the small teacup. The water was colorless, and it was slightly cold. If he was not wrong, Tang Yin was sure that it was just ordinary well water. This person was really simple to the extreme. After putting down the teacup, Zwafan shook his head. As expected, he was rejected. Tang Yin was not discouraged. This was within his expectations. He continued, I believe that you can see that the gray space still has potential. Oh right, this morning He explained in detail what had happened in the morning battle. He then spread his hands and said, with such a team, the Gray Coat Army will be of great help. If their strength can reach a higher level, I believe that they will be even more useful. These words were purely self-praise. It was also Tang Un's way of testing Zwafan. Since he had joined the Gray Coat Army, he must have attached great importance to it. However, Tang Un was quickly disappointed. Zwafan still had the same indifferent expression. He was unmoved. TSK. Tang Un secretly smacked his lips. He did not fall for this trick. Again, of course, please help. I will not treat you for free. I have some money. If there is anything you want or if it is inconvenient for you to do, just tell me. In short, I will definitely get it done for you. You like to drink tea, right? Yes, the underground water here is indeed clear and sweet. It has a different taste. It is much better than the mineral water from the farmer's 3 punches. Cough, cough. However, if you drink too much underground water, you will inevitably get sick of it. Occasionally, you can change your taste and taste the different flavors of the best tea leaves. It is not bad. I know that you like peace and quiet. However, this training will not take up too much of your time. 1 hour per day will do. How about half an hour? Not talking, not shaking your head. Then I will take your silence as a yes. Haha, congratulations on becoming the first teaching assistant of the gray space. Please, give me some reaction. Shaking your head does not count. Tang Yin's patience had been trained by the old butler. He was incomparably tenacious. At first, Zwafan would occasionally shake his head. However, in the end, he simply closed his eyes and sat quietly. 1 hour, 2 hours, Tang Yin's mouth was dry from talking, and the topics started to deviate continuously. Astronomy, geography, local customs, and even small jokes of the modern world were brought up one by one. It was as if he would not stop until he spat out the truth. Finally, the sky darkened. Zwafan sighed and raised his head to look at Tang Un. Ha, there's a reaction. Tang Un immediately became alert. However, before he could speak, Zwafan waved his right hand and a golden light enveloped his body. Then, he stood up and grabbed the immobile Tang In by the shoulder and walked towards the door. Hey, what are you doing? It is impolite to chase a guest away. Of course, the imprisonment of a Void Realm martial artist was not something that Tang Un could break free from. However, this was not acupuncture, so he could still talk. It is getting late. You should at least treat me to dinner. Don't worry. I will leave after eating. Creak. The door opened. Great. Don't help me. I'm not drunk. Bored, don't worry. Isn't it just that? Phew. It is a kid. Next time, we will find 180 people to block him. I guarantee that we will beat him up. Beat him up until his mother cannot recognize him. Phew. That's right. How many people does he have? When Zwafan opened the door, he saw a few youths holding wine bottles. They were hugging each other's shoulders and walking unsteadily. From time to time, they would speak with their tongues hanging out. Perhaps the sound of the door opening had startled them. They looked over and saw what was going on. Bang, bang, bang. The wine bottles shattered on the ground. Zwafan ignored them. He placed Tang In at the door and turned to close the door behind him. The faint golden light also disappeared at this moment. Tang In stood firm and immediately shouted, I will come back tomorrow. Inviting people was not offending them. Although he had already caused Zwafan to be annoyed, he could not barge in now. Therefore, after Tang In shouted, he turned around and prepared to leave. Tang In looked at the youths standing in a daze, especially Borg. He could not help but exclaim in surprise. He casually waved his hand and said, Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Tang In was stunned. He knew that Borg did not have a good impression of him and was about to tease him. Who would have thought that they would all greet him back? Rubbing his nose, Tang In left in confusion. Slap! Looking at Tang In's back, Borg suddenly raised his hand and slapped himself. Good evening? Good your ass. Why was his mouth so cheap? The young men beside him also had complicated expressions on their faces. They were just talking about finding someone to beat up the other party, but now they were responding to someone else's greeting. Although they didn't follow Borg's example and slap themselves, their faces were still burning. But what could they do? These youths were not ordinary people either. Their elders were almost all the old ministers. Of course, they knew Zhuofan's identity and strength. Chapter 287. The battle between the First Army and the Fourth Army did not spread widely. After all, the gray space was not part of the military system, and because of their outstanding performance this time, the military was suppressed, so naturally, they would not publicize it with great fanfare. However, in the military, this matter caused a huge uproar. It was just a few dozen people, but they could paralyze an entire regiment? It sounded like a story, but it really happened. After Marshal Meng returned, he called for a meeting with the officers of the 4 battalions and above. It was not all about scolding and lecturing, but more importantly, Meng was envious. He also wanted to create a gray space in the military. If a few dozen people could paralyze an entire regiment, then wouldn't a few hundred people be able to defeat an entire army? Although Meng knew that this was not reliable, it was still worth it to paralyze a few hundred people. Therefore, he was very interested in this plan and forced the officers to make all kinds of deductions. The military was very lively, but there was also an undercurrent among the higher-ups in the base. This matter was also related to Twain. After the drunken youths returned, they passed on the news of Zhuofan and Twain's close relationship to their elders. Needless to say, it caused a lot of shock. Who was Zhuofan? He was a void-level warrior and the invisible guardian of the Gray Coat Army. In the past, there was a saying in the encampment that the Gray Coat Army could do without anyone but Rosa. This point was obvious, and the brand officials also knew it, so they never stopped trying to kill Rosa. However, it was a pity that the Gray Coat Army never had a fixed location to set up camp. Moreover, they liked to run to places with complicated terrain like the 100,000 Mountains. This made the Brand government unable to find a chance to deal a fatal blow even though they had a large number of troops. So later, the Brand officials simply came up with a two-pronged approach, posting bounties in various unions. There was no doubt that this was effective. In the beginning, many mercenaries and bandits were very interested in this mission. Just because the authorities couldn't find them didn't mean that they couldn't. Take the 100,000 Mountains, for example. The bandits, who could be considered half of the natives here, had naturally seen the Gray Coat Army before. They didn't mind exchanging this information for a sizable bounty. Tang In did not know, but the old men of the Gray Coat Army still remembered what happened more than 10 years ago. At that time, there were assassins, bandits, and mercenaries sneaking in almost every day for the bounty. But when they got close to Rosa, they would meet Zhuofan, who was armed with a single sword. They would fight, kill, fight again, and continue to kill. For a moment, the Gray Coat Army was like a bottomless pit, devouring the lives of countless mercenaries. At that time, Zhuofan's strength was at the peak of the Earth grade. Occasionally, he would encounter people of similar strength. However, even if these people could block Zhuofan, they would not be able to block the arrows of tens of millions of soldiers. In the end, they would be beaten to death. In the end, other than those who had just joined the guild and those who didn't believe in heresy, basically no one was willing to take on this seemingly very tempting task. Without Rosa, there would be no Gray Coat Army today. But without Zhuofan, there would be no Rosa today. For such an important person, the old ministers and some people would naturally try to befriend him, but Zhuofan was not moved by force or persuasion. There were even some people who had joined the Gray Coat Army for many years and had never seen him speak. So much so that later, everyone gradually forgot about this void-grade cultivator who had always been by Luo Sha's side, but never had a sense of existence. But now, this Wafan was actually on good terms with Tang Yin. After being surprised, some people couldn't help but guess what this meant. It was no wonder that people had such sensitive thoughts. Zhuofan's actions were simply too rare. But before this news could spread, it was confirmed to be a misunderstanding. The reason was very simple. When Tang Yin said that he would come back tomorrow, he was not lying. Early the next morning, he appeared in front of Zhuofan's room. But by this time, Zhuofan had already disappeared. Obviously, Zhuofan was also afraid of seeing this guy, who kept nagging but was also extremely patient. But how could Tang Yin give up so easily? Tracking people was his strength. With a single order, the Gray Space members all set out and began a carpet search around the station. Zhuofan would not be too far away from Rosa. As long as they grasped this point, they would not have to worry about not being able to find him. Once they found him, Tang would appear like a ghost. Without saying anything, he would just wander around Zhuofan's field of vision. If Rosa was busy with something, then Tang Yin would seize the opportunity to stick close to her and continue nagging at her. Zhuofan had also thought of many ways to deal with this. First, he would imprison Tang Yin and keep him in place. But without Tang Yin, there were still the Gray Space members who received the order. David and the others also knew about Tang Yin's plan and couldn't help but feel excited. What kind of joke was this? The guidance of a void-grade cultivator. As long as there was a glimmer of hope, this kind of opportunity had to be grasped. Later, as the Gray Space members were immobilized by the golden battle, Chi one after another, the higher-ups realized that things were not as they thought. At this time, they had a new idea. They thought that Tang Yin was just like them, trying to befriend Zhuofan. But now, it was obvious that he had not succeeded. Tang Yin and the Gray Space had been in the limelight recently because of the city's publicity. Now that they had suffered a setback, they naturally attracted the ridicule of people like Borg. But as a few days passed, they could not help but admire them. Because Tang Yin and the others were not affected at all, they were still pestering Zhuofan. Battle Chi could immobilize them for a while, but it would eventually disappear. Besides, you can't not even give him time to eat, right? As long as the Battle Chi disappeared, Tang Yin and the others would still be able to do whatever they wanted. At this time, Tang Yin finally found one of Zhuofan's weaknesses. Oh, it was not accurate to call it a weakness. It should be called a characteristic. Zhuofan was not as cold as he looked. Instead, he was more like a good person, especially to his own people. He would not go to extremes. Battle Chi could not be maintained for long, but as long as one wanted to, they could immobilize a person for a day. But Zhuofan would not do that. He would only immobilize them the next time he saw them. 2 or 3 days later, Zhuofan started using another trick. As long as Rosa was busy, he would not wait for Tang Yin and the others to approach and would directly soar into the sky. Of course, Tang Yin and the others could not soar into the sky. They could only wait below. Zhuofan only had 1 foot in the void grade, so he could not stay in the sky for long. As long as he came down, he would continue to pester him. But Zhuofan did not care, because as long as he rested on the ground, he could continue to soar into the sky. Although it was a bit troublesome, it was still a lot quieter than before. But after half a day, Zhuofan realized that he had underestimated Tang Yin. Looking at the few pieces of paper in front of him that were stuck together, and because of the fire below, which was slowly rising, he was completely speechless. Moreover, this thing quickly became popular in the encampment. Tang Yin was also happy to teach the children how to make it. The only requirement was that they write the words Gray Space on the paper. Soon, Zhuofan could no longer soar into the sky because the encampment was filled with these things. In the end, Zhuofan simply did not do anything and just followed Rosa. He pretended that he did not see Tang Yin and pretended that he did not hear the nagging in his ears. The two sides began to engage in a protracted battle. Tang Yin was also very patient and continued to bombard as if he did not get tired. When Rosa first saw Tang Yin, he didn't pay much attention to him. However, in the following half a day, he saw Tang Yin wandering around, and he couldn't help but wonder. After asking Tang Yin about the situation, He looked at the expressionless Fan in surprise and chuckled. She did not intervene in this matter. Instead, she watched with interest, as if she was curious about who was more patient between the two. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to Kamachidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 288. The night wind was chilly and the night was cold. It's right there. Oh, thank you. Phew. Tang, and opened his mouth and let out a breath of white air. He thanked the Annie who pointed the way and held little Carol's hand as they walked toward a few brightly lit buildings. That was where the Gray Coat Army's voice was transmitted, the propaganda department. According to the Gray Coat Army's old rules, they naturally had to celebrate the success of the city's propaganda program. However, Tang didn't know why it was delayed until now. Recently, he had put all his attention on hiring Fan as an assistant and hadn't paid attention to the current situation in the base. It was probably the start of the second wave of the city's propaganda program. Tang guessed. Brother Tang, why are we here? Little Carol looked up and asked. Tang scratched his head. Of course, to eat something good. Oh, little Carol nodded, looking a little expectant. It was a party, so naturally there would be snacks and desserts. However, Tang didn't come here just to bring little Carol to eat. To be honest, he had never been interested in any celebration party. He only came because of Lass's special invitation. The person Lassa sent didn't say anything specific, but from what Tang knew about her, she probably wanted to help with something. TSK. If that was the case, he didn't know if he could use this to deal with Fan. Tang? Just as Tang was about to enter the propaganda department, a voice like a bell with a slight question came from his side. Hi, good evening, Josiah. Tang was very familiar with the owner of this voice. Before he turned around, he waved and greeted her. Hello, Sister Josiah. Little Carol also nodded and greeted her. Josiah, in a white dress, ran over. She first touched Carol's soft hair. Good evening, little Carol. Then she got up and smiled at Tang. Hee, it's really you? I thought you didn't like such occasions. It's not bad to come here once in a while. You know, there are a lot of beauties here. Tang raised his eyebrows and joked. Huh, liar, I don't believe it. Josiah patted Tang and shoulder familiarly and laughed. You've wrongly accused me. Tang took a small step back and spread out his arms exaggeratedly. Look, I'm pretty lucky, aren't I? I've just arrived, and I've already met one. Uh-huh. Josiah was stunned for a moment. Then he covered his mouth and laughed heartily. As long as one was a woman, they would always express their fondness for the voice that praised them. Speaking of which, aren't you cold? Wearing this. Tang pointed at Josiah and said, although it was a conservative long dress, her white and jade-like forearms were still exposed. Besides, how thick could a dress be? Little Carol pouted as if she didn't agree with Tang's words. She just thought that the dress was very beautiful. It's a party. If a woman doesn't wear this, what else would she wear? Besides, have you forgotten my profession? Josiah raised a small face and said proudly. Oh, Tang slapped his forehead and shook his head slightly. I forgot that you're an ice magician. The profession of magicians was particularly sensitive to external elements that belonged to their element. Josiah was now an intermediate ice magician, so he could naturally resist this degree of cold. Okay, Tang, let's go in first. At this time, the number of people who came here gradually increased. Josiah stood at the door and naturally attracted a lot of attention, so he proposed to go in first. Well, after you, beautiful lady, Tang, and spread out his hands and continued to tease. Hey, you. Josiah's beautiful face flushed red. He believed that if it weren't for the fact that there were too many people here, he would definitely take revenge. Glancing at Tang angrily, he took little Carol's hand and walked into the door of the publicity department first. Tang chuckled and followed. Out of habit, he quickly glanced around. There were no eye-catching people, but there were obviously more guards. It was probably because Rosa was coming here. As soon as he entered the party hall of the publicity department, a warm current came to his face, and then all kinds of voices entered his ears one after another. Miss Josiah, Captain Josiah, oh, our little Rosa is here. Hey, this is Josiah's reputation was unquestionable, not to mention that this was the publicity department. So in all kinds of greetings, Josiah looked at Tang inapologetically. Tang shrugged, indicating that it was nothing. He stepped aside and watched Josiah skillfully respond to all kinds of greetings with little Carol. The layout of the hall was very simple and casual. There was a table of food, desserts, and bottles of wine around it. There were also some musical instruments on the side. There was no fixed person playing, so anyone could go up and perform impromptu. As for the large empty space in the middle, there were now many people standing there chatting. After the party began, that should be the place to dance. When Tang was in Lian City, he had been to a few aristocratic banquets. The situation here was, of course, not comparable. But just like that, the people in the hall were already very satisfied. One had to know that before there was no fixed place, they all gathered in the open air. The reason why the Gray Coat Army held frequent gatherings was also because of this consideration. In the cold winter, bonfires were not enough to warm people's bodies. But as long as they held a party, everyone gathered together to sing and dance, and they could quickly drive away the cold. Looking around, Rosa and the other big shots had not arrived yet. Except for the people who went to Riva City with Josiah to promote, Tang did not know anyone else here. He found a random corner and took something to fill his stomach first. Because the party had not officially started, most people were chatting in groups of 3 or 5. Of course, the content was not like the business between the aristocrats. It could be said that because they were in the middle of a barren mountain, there was nothing new to see. Everyone was talking about the recent interesting things. For example, the sky lantern that Tang made previously was talked about by many people. After observing for a while, Tang felt that his previous joke was not wrong. There were so many women in the publicity department, it was no wonder that Tang was so emotional. The fact was that there was no serious preference for men in this world. It was very common for women to come out and do things. Even in the Gray Coat Army, there were teams formed by women. But because there were not many of them and they did not form a formal organization, they rarely had the chance to fight. But if one were to ask which department in the Gray Coat Army had the most women, it would undoubtedly be the publicity department. This was also conceivable. The Gray Coat Army took the civilian route. Women of this class rarely had the chance to come into contact with fighting aura in battle. So, a clerical job like the publicity department was undoubtedly more popular among them. When men and women worked together, the work would not be tiring. This was a principle that applied everywhere. In addition, the Gray Coat Army did not have a rule against love. So, when there were both men and women in a department, the opportunity to be close to the water was naturally not to be missed. Tang's observation was very sharp. Some of the young men and women who seemed to be talking quietly at a distance were easily caught by him. TSK, what a department with love. But even so, Tang still found that most of the young men present would occasionally look at Josiah in the crowd. Beauty, intelligence, a unique temperament that could not be concealed, the noble status of a mage. It could be said that no matter where, Josiah would be the focus of attention. It was also because of this that although Josiah had always been gentle, most of the young men only looked at him with admiration. Very few of them mustered the courage to go up and greet him. At this moment, Tang's gaze did not fall on Josiah. Of course, because of the surrounding people, he could not see him even if he wanted to. He was currently looking at little Carol with a frown. Although many people greeted her warmly, little Carol's expression was still cold. Her small face was tense, and she was unmoved. In fact, Tang had discovered this long ago. Apart from himself and a limited number of acquaintances, little Carol almost never interacted with outsiders, let alone acted coquettishly, smiled, and so on. This was something that Fry and the others rarely saw. At first, Tang only thought that little Carol had been stimulated by the previous tragedy and would get better in the future. But after a few months, not only did little Carol's symptoms not lessen, but she seemed to have gotten used to it. Tang did not want little Carol to learn from Zhuofan and not say a word all day. She was a child, so she had to act like a child. Thus, he had recently started to change this situation. Bringing her to parties was one of the ways. But looking at the current situation, it seemed to have little effect. Scratching his head, Tangen was not an impatient person, but he really had no experience in taking care of and raising children. It was even more impossible for him to let someone else take care of her. After all, little Carol was not even willing to live with Josiah. What a headache. You also like Miss Josiah? Just as Tangen was scratching his head and frowning in thought, a slightly sharp voice came from the side. Turning his head, a young man with freckles on his face, holding a wine glass, sat over. Don't think about it. It's useless. The young man with freckles followed Tangen's gaze and looked at Josiah in the crowd. He shrugged. You can't just think of some novel ways to move the other party and make her happy. And even if Miss Josiah is not someone who cares about appearance, status, and so on, the people around her won't let you around so easily. Tangen raised his eyebrows. You misunderstood. Misunderstood? There's no need to hide it. Which man here doesn't want to be Josiah's companion? With two chuckles, the young man patted Tangen on the shoulder and then pointed to the crowd. Do you see that person? On the left of Josiah, that person who deliberately puts on an elegant and reserved face but can't hide his arrogance and lust. This description, Tangen narrowed his eyes and nodded. It was appropriate. His name is Quincy, the nephew of publicity minister Kuan Wei. The few people around him also have some background. How about it? Now you understand what I mean. Tangen nodded in realization. Things like identity and status were possible when a few people gathered together, let alone this gray coat army that had formed into a collective. Perhaps this kind of identity and status could not produce any extraordinary special effects now, but for others, it was practical. Thinking of this, he turned his head. Then why don't you give it a try? Although the celebration banquet was for internal personnel of the publicity department, it did not prevent some people from entering through other means. For example, Tangen himself, and another example was this ordinary-looking young man in front of him. The reason for this was because the people in the publicity department often referred to Josiah with the suffix of commander. Me? This is called having self-awareness. The young man laughed and then pointed at the freckles on his face. Of course, you can also understand it as having low self-esteem. Tangen heard this and laughed. This young man was an interesting person. Introduce us. The young man raised his wine glass. Fei Rue. Hua. At this moment, there was a commotion in the distance. It sounded like a beehive had exploded. Tangen turned his head and saw a red rose raised in front of Josiah through the gaps in the crowd. He could not see the person who gave it, but judging from the previous position, it should be Quincy without a doubt. This kind of occasion, what an idiot. Fei Rue, who was beside him, saw this scene and could not help but sigh. As soon as he finished speaking, he felt the corner of his eyes darken. The person beside him suddenly stood up and knocked the wine glass that he did not manage to retrieve. Tangen. Before Fei Rue could recover from the familiarity of the name, he saw Tangen finish the wine in his cup in one gulp. Then, he put down the cup and strode towards the center of the field. He was walking towards a crowd where Joshua was standing. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 289. There are many ways to woo someone. Candlelight dinners, sweet words, holding flowers, kneeling on one knee, or even rolling around on the ground. As long as it was successful, no one would feel inferior about the process. Of course, public courtship was also one of them. It could even be said that this method had been used since ancient times. The reason why it had been used so many times was mainly because the scene was grand and the atmosphere was romantic. As long as the person being confessed to had a good impression of the person, they would be moved by the crowd's incitement. In the end, they would nod in agreement in a daze. Although Josiah could be impulsive at times, he was generally a calm and rational person. Tangen knew this very well, so the possibility of her accepting the flowers was infinitely close to zero. However, Tang and still stood up and walked over instead of sitting there and watching how she cleverly resolved the situation. Tang did not know what he was thinking at this moment. Philip had done something similar in the past, even crazier than this. However, at that time, he just laughed it off. Now, he was a little angry. It was probably because this foppish guy in front of him was an eyesore. Yes, he was an eyesore. Since that was the case, he might as well send him away. At this moment, the atmosphere in the hall was a little strange. There were about 10 people standing in the crowd, clapping their hands desperately in an attempt to liven up the atmosphere. Of course, the effect was there. Soon, there were orderly cries of "accept him" around Josiah. On the other side, a few people had appeared out of nowhere. They were picking up musical instruments and playing a lingering song. However, after the crowd recovered from their shock, they looked coldly at this scene. Obviously, no one believed that Josiah would accept it. Fei Rue's previous scolding of him being an idiot was not without reason. There were countless people here who liked Josiah. Although most of them knew that they had no chance, how could they be incited to support another person to take away their goddess? Quincy's identity was a little special. Otherwise, someone might have stood up before Tang-un and dragged him out for a chat. However, from this aspect, Quincy's choice of this place was not completely without calculation. This was his home ground. Although he did not have a specific position, he had always shown himself as an assistant to the head of the publicity department, and Josiah was only a leader of the publicity team. It could be said that if Quincy's confession partner was an ordinary woman, there would be a lot of bonus points. Quincy bowed and said gently, "Josiah, please forgive me for using such a presumptuous way to express my love. I really can't refuse the strong desire in my heart. Please accept ugh." Halfway through his affectionate words, Quincy felt a pain in his elbow. He couldn't help but loosen his grip, and the red rose fell. "Accept him! Accept him!" The orderly cries could not help but become chaotic at this moment. The surrounding people were a little dumbfounded. It can't be Big Brother. What do you mean by screw up at such a crucial moment? With a soft sound, the falling red rose was caught by a hand. You don't want it anymore? TSK, TSK, what a pity." Josiah opened his mouth and stared blankly at Tang, who suddenly appeared. "Oh, it's yours?" Tang-in raised his left hand and scratched his head. He took a step forward and handed the rose to Josiah. His movements were very casual, and his words were very natural. This made the surrounding people have a strong sense of absurdity. Where did this person come from? Didn't he know the situation? Did he think he was picking up something on the road and returning it to its owner? Hey, wake up, wake up. So many people are watching. Give me some face and quickly accept it. Tang-in was very close to Josiah. Under the cover of the surrounding music and the continued cries of people who did not know the situation, his lips moved slightly and whispered, "Are you confessing to me?" Josiah came back to his senses and shrank in Tang-un's shadow, whispering. Tang-in was taken aback, and then he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Sister, what time is it now, and you're still in the mood to joke?" Josiah bit his lower lip, moved, then looked up with a smile, tucked the hair on his forehead behind his ear, and reached out to take the rose. There was dead silence around, and everyone stared at this scene with wide eyes. Tang didn't know if it was an illusion or something else, but his ears moved as if he heard a series of glass breaking. "This flower is not mine, but thank you anyway." With that said, Josiah cut off a part of the flower trail and inserted it next to little Carol's ear. "I think she's more suitable." Whoosh, clap, clap, clap. The atmosphere instantly rose from the freezing point to the boiling point, and there was a series of sighs of relief around. The young people clapped their hands desperately, and their eyes were almost filled with tears. A goddess is a goddess after all. How can she be so easily conquered? Thank you everyone." Tang raised his hands and kept thanking everyone. It was as if he had done a good deed and was being praised. When everyone saw his behavior, they couldn't help but laugh even more happily. The applause reached a climax again, and the sound was like thunder. At this time, it didn't matter whether this guy did it on purpose or not. The key was that he did ruin Quincy's confession ceremony. Damn it, who are you? If there was anyone who was the most angry here, it was undoubtedly Quincy. He saw that his careful preparation had turned into a farce in the end. After coming back to his senses, he couldn't help but ask angrily with a sullen face. That's not important. It's always been my style to do good deeds without leaving my name. Of course, if you must know, you can call me Lei Feng. Tang Yin nodded and said with a serious face. Quincy was now convinced that the other party was not from the publicity department. His mind instantly filtered through the names of the big shots in the station, and once again confirmed that the other party was not someone he couldn't afford to offend. After thinking about all this, he raised his head and secretly winked in a certain direction. As the person involved, Quincy certainly knew that he had been plotted against. In a rage, he didn't intend to let this so-called Lei Feng go. At this time, "Oh, so you're here. Why did you run away halfway through your drink?" A hand landed on Tang Yin's shoulder, and then a face with many freckles appeared. "Fei Rui?" Quincy frowned, and his gloomy face eased a little. The young man who came out later was Fei Rui, who had been talking to Tang Yin earlier. At this time, he had a puzzled look on his face. Quincy, you don't look well. What's wrong? He's my friend. Is there a misunderstanding here?" Tang Yin didn't stop Fei Rui from doing so. He only looked at him with a half-smile, and the latter immediately responded with an apologetic look. "Misunderstanding? Oof." Quincy narrowed his eyes and snorted. "Fei Rui, it's not that I don't want to give you face, but your friend can't leave now." "Can't leave?" Fei Rui opened his mouth, speechless. Of course, he knew Tang Yin's identity. Back when the Gray Coat Army was surrounded, Tang Yin broke out of the encirclement despite being heavily guarded, and returned as a hero after capturing an important hostage. Now, Quincy was saying that he couldn't leave? To be honest, Fei Rui didn't mind this stupid Quincy being taught a lesson. However, they were elders after all, so he still tried his best. "Quincy, listen to me. This is really a misunderstanding. Let's just have a drink." At this point, even a fool would understand. Quincy understood the meaning behind his words, but it only made him angrier. Fei Rui was obviously asking him to have a drink and apologize. How would he accept this? "Fei Rui, don't worry about this. I'll apologize to you in the future. You get out of my way." Boom! There was a loud sound, and the surroundings instantly quieted down. Quincy and Fei Rui turned their heads stiffly and saw a big man slowly sliding down and landing on the ground, unconscious. On the wooden wall, there was a human-shaped hole with 4 limbs. It was very eye-catching. When he turned back, Tang Yin clapped his hands indifferently, as if he was dusting off dust. "Fei Rui, your method didn't work. Let me do something simpler. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Yin. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 290. Be *starred. Perhaps because he used too much force, Kummel's wrist was twisted. He reached out with his trembling left hand. "Who do you think you are? Are you worthy of Josiah? Who gave you the right to recruit people? Who gave you the right to order your subordinates to hurt people?" The more he spoke, the angrier Kummel's face became. He took a few steps forward and kicked Quincy. Bang, bang, bang. Quincy screamed in pain as he held his head and rolled around. Actually, even if he used all his strength, the old Kummel would not be able to kick Quincy that hard. However, the slap just now was real. Quincy was dizzy from the slap, and his head was buzzing. He had yet to regain his senses, and now that he was being kicked, he subconsciously let out a blood-curdling scream. "You still dare to dodge?" I. After a few kicks, Kummel's forehead was covered in sweat. He panted heavily and looked around. He pushed through the crowd and walked toward the human-shaped hole. He picked up a piece of wood that was as thick as an arm. "I'm going to beat you to death today. You be *starred. Old Kunwell, don't be like this. Calm down, calm down. Quincy has already learned his lesson." Oh Meng and the others were shocked. They either grabbed Kunwell's sleeves or blocked his path. The place was in chaos again. On the other side, Fei Rui quickly bowed to Twain and immediately went forward to help Quincy, who was bleeding from his head, up from the ground. Fei Rueyu. Quincy regained his senses, but he was stunned when he saw what Fei Rue did. What are you waiting for? Go, go. Quincy looked at Fei Rue with a complicated expression. He wiped the blood from his brow and ran toward the door. I'm going to beat you to death today. You be asterisk starred. Get out of the way, don't stop me. Kunwal could not move under the combined efforts of the old department heads. In the end, he smashed the wooden stick in his hand at Quincy. Whoosh! Bang! The wooden stick hit the door beside Quincy. He did not dare to stay and quickly ran out, disappearing into the night. The chaos lasted for about 10 minutes before it finally stopped. Under the persuasion of Losha and the others, Kunwal gradually calmed down. The banquet began after Rosa gave a short speech to congratulate the city on their victory in the first battle. Of course, the atmosphere couldn't be lifted in a short time. After all, the human-shaped hole was still there. However, with the gradual addition of music and the dancing of some impatient young men and women, the situation eventually eased and recovered. At this time, the people in the field also learned about Tang An's identity from the constant discussion. Needless to say, they were all shocked, and their thoughts were all complicated. Tang An's reputation in the encampment was mixed. Those who praised him worshipped him for his heroic actions in turning the tides, while those who criticized him were dissatisfied with his ruthless actions in the encampment. However, most of these things were just hearsay. Now, everyone present had seen Tang An's way of doing things. No matter who the other party was, as long as they provoked him, he would either break their fingers or hang them on the wall. Although they were in awe of Tang An's methods on the whole, everyone in the publicity department still appreciated him. Most people didn't like Quincy's character. Now that he was in such a sorry state, it was naturally very satisfying. Moreover, Tang An had helped the publicity department a lot in the last city promotion. Therefore, before long, many people came over to greet him with wine glasses. Of course, there were also people who were suspicious of the relationship between Tang An and Josiah. After all, everyone knew that Josiah would refuse, but Tang An still stood up. It was hard not to think that Tang An was interested in Josiah. Tang An didn't know the complicated thoughts of the crowd. Of course, even if he knew, he wouldn't care. Right now, he was just having a headache over the glasses of wine in front of him. Ever since he was forced to drink by Fry, he was traumatized by it. Fortunately, his savior came soon. Tang An, I'm really sorry. I didn't teach you well, Sai. The person who came to apologize was Kunwal. When he came, everyone naturally had to give him face and leave. You're too serious. Tang An hurriedly stopped Kunwal, who was about to bow and apologize. The other party was a department head. Moreover, he wasn't directly in the wrong. Naturally, Tang An wouldn't accept such a big bow. In fact, Tang An didn't believe that Kunwal didn't know about Quincy's actions in the publicity department. If he couldn't grasp this, he wouldn't be a department head. However, it was hard to say. Once a person rose to a high position, it was very common for relatives and family members to come to him for help. Quincy didn't have a specific position in the publicity department. On one hand, it showed that Kunwal knew that this nephew of his wouldn't amount to much. On the other hand, it could be seen that Kunwal was not blindly nepotism. It could be said that he was a wise old man who wouldn't easily make enemies. It was enough to know this. After chatting for a while, Kunwal said that he would definitely get Quincy to come and apologize. Then, Tang An proposed a toast, and this matter was over. After sending Kunwal away, Tang An looked around and found that Josiah was eating desserts with little Carol at another table. From time to time, a young man would come up to ask for a dance, but Josiah would politely decline. Captain Tang, I'm really sorry about just now. There weren't many people in the gray space, so when people called Tang An, they would add the suffix captain. Tang An turned around and saw Fei Rue walking over with a glass of wine in his hand with an apologetic expression. He came up to him and bowed. My father and Minister Kunwal are good friends, so Tang An waved his hand and said casually, It's fine. You didn't do anything wrong just now. This wasn't a lie. Tang In really admired Fei Rue. It could be said that he was a smart person. Fei Rue had interfered several times at the right time. The first time he stopped Quincy, Tang Un was in the wrong, so he naturally wouldn't blame Fei Rue. If it wasn't for that big man sneak attack, things might not have escalated to this point. Then, when he was pointed out by Kunwal, he directly told the truth. There was nothing to say about this. He did what a smart person would do. What Tang In admired the most was when he helped Quincy up and persuaded him to leave quickly. Don't misunderstand. Tang In naturally didn't have a good impression of Quincy. Under those circumstances, Quincy wouldn't have been beaten to death. Even if Fei Rue hadn't come out, Meng and the others would have chased Quincy away. However, Fei Rue had come out at this time. After all, he had reported Quincy just now. If it had been a normal person, they would have thought that since they had already offended Quincy, they wouldn't have stepped forward to help him even if they didn't have the chance to do something so strenuous and unrewarding. However, Fei Rue was smart. Regardless of whether Kunwal really wanted to beat Quincy to death or not, he would calm down after the incident. After all, family was family. When he thought of Fei Rue's actions, he would resolve any possible grudges between them. Moreover, as long as Quincy didn't die, he would naturally receive Kunwal's teachings. In order to prevent him from having any unnecessary thoughts of revenge, Kunwal would definitely tell him about Fei Rue's good intentions. When that time came, Fei Rue would definitely come to apologize. Yes, with his personality, he would definitely do so. Quincy would recall the kind words he had spoken to him before. It would be reasonable for him to be grateful to Fei Rue. That was the logic. Looking at the overall situation, Fei Rue hadn't offended Tang, and even though he had only interfered a few times. Instead, he had gained Kunwal's favor and Quincy's gratitude. This kind of method could be said to be silent and watertight. Tang In didn't want anyone to propose a toast to him. Fei Rue seemed to have noticed this as well. As a result, the conversation between the two was very smooth and harmonious, making others feel embarrassed to approach them. As for the content of the conversation, they chatted casually about everything. This was the advantage of talking to smart people. They knew that this was the first time they had met each other, so they knew what to do and wouldn't talk too much. The music was melodious and the dance was beautiful. The two of them continued like this until Luo Sha walked over with a smile on his face. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 291. Leader. Not bad. A hero saving a damsel in distress. Are you jealous? Pfft. Cough, 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 cough. Tang In put down a wine glass. He was choking and his body was trembling. It had to be said that Rose's first sentence was too impactful. Tang In, who was usually calm, also lost his composure. After clearing his throat, Tang In adjusted his expression and said helplessly, "Leader, don't joke with me. This should be a sacrifice for a friend." "Oh, is that so? I heard that Josiah accepted your confession of Rose's. Between you two," Rose's mouth moved slightly, revealing a teasing smile. Tang In touched his nose. He had a headache. He did not explain the reason. He said directly, "You should ask Josiah about this." After a pause, he quickly said, "Well, leader, why are you looking for me?" "Sly." Rosa saw through Tang Un's intention to change the topic and laughed. Then he looked at the dancing crowd and said, "The city's publicity plan is about to officially start." As expected, Tang In nodded to show that he understood. "Well, you were there that time. You should know that Josiah proposed to establish a systems contact organization in the city. This suggestion is very necessary, so we have been discussing for the past few days. We want to choose a person to be in charge of this organization." Tang In thought quickly and frowned. This organization? Well, isn't the leader in charge? Tang In omitted some words. Establishing a systems contact organization in the city was, of course, the first thing to do was to serve the publicity. However, the city was a place where all kinds of information gathered. This meant that this organization would inevitably involve some information. It was not an exaggeration to say that Tang In could foresee that this secret organization would definitely become the window for the Gray Coat Army to understand the outside world. The importance of information was self-evident. Just like assassins like Tang In, if they did not collect complete information about the target, they would not assassinate. Not to mention the power of a corporation. That was a necessary basis for the higher-ups to make major decisions. It was such a sensitive organization, but Tang In knew from Luo Sha's tone that she was not in charge of it. I can't. I already have too many things on my plate. Rosa shook his head and narrowed his eyes. Of course, these are not the main reasons. Some choices are purely dictated by the circumstances. Well, since no one has invited you to dance, I'll say something else. More than 10 years ago, I joined the Gray Coat Army. Back then, my thoughts were very simple. I just wanted to change something. Haha, just like the current Josiah. Later, I realized that it wouldn't work. There were too many obstacles, both internal and external. Some of my ideas were supported by the leader at the time, but when it came to actual implementation, the results were always minimal. According to what you said, this is the limitation of commoners. Not long after that, the Gray Coat Army was annihilated when they occupied the city, and I took over the position of leader. At that time, I learned 2 lessons. First, if I wanted to achieve the wishes of the Gray Coat Army, I would have to resort to blood and swords in the end. Second, the role of commoners is huge, but sometimes it is also very small. I had to find someone who knew military command and knew how to manage organizations. Omen used to be a general in the regular army of the Empire. I asked Zwafan to capture him. Kuan Wei and a few other ministers used to be rich businessmen. After the collapse, they were also found by me. You know Minister Bosco? He used to be a noble. After being surrounded by the government, he was also accepted by me. I don't care if they have the same ideas as me. I give them power, they're responsible for doing things, and they have to show me results. Now that I think about it, it was really risky at that time. Fortunately, maybe it was because I had good eyesight, they didn't do anything to betray me. Now, since I found these people, I have to respect their ideas and needs. Moreover, the Gray Coat Army has never been a dictatorship. I don't need to monopolize power, so I still have to let go of what should be let go. Tang In pursed his lips. He felt that his throat was a little dry. Rebellion was never a simple thing. Tang In originally thought very highly of Rosa, but now he found that he had underestimated this woman who had dark skin and looked like a citizen of a small town in the south. Rosa said it lightly. She said that she had good eyesight, that she gave them power, that it was quite risky, and so on. But Tang In knew that this kind of thing couldn't be so simple. It was no exaggeration to say that she was walking on the edge of a cliff at that time, and there was no ready-made mountain road in front of her. Any turn, thorns, and rocks could doom her eternally. After a moment of silence, Tang In said, "What you're doing is very dangerous. Unless you don't want to gain anything, there is no decision that is not dangerous." And Rosa raised her eyebrows and chuckled. "I don't doubt anyone easily, but I have to choose the person I trust the most. Josiah is also one of the candidates this time. I have talked to her. Haha, you will definitely support her, right?" This was a statement. Tang In touched his nose. He felt that there was a hidden meaning in Rosa's words. "Of course, but I don't think I have the right? Just as Rosa said, the higher-ups had been discussing this for a few days. He was just a small captain of the gray space. What right did he have to intervene? You don't have to think about this. You will have it when the time comes." Rosa smiled mysteriously. Tang In nodded. He didn't waste his energy guessing. Instead, he asked another important question. "Are you sure Josiah will be elected?" Since Rosa had decided not to be the sole decision-maker, her vote would be nullified. In that case, it was hard to say who the remaining ministers would choose. "Of course, I'm not absolutely sure." Rosa waved her hand. She seemed relaxed. "At first, we had 6 candidates, but now it has become 3. Do you know why? Is it because someone is making a move?" Tang In's heart skipped a beat. There were only so many people in the higher-ups. If there were too many candidates, it would undoubtedly divide the votes. Since there were fewer candidates now, 3 of the ministers must have been persuaded by someone. Not bad. Your brain works quite fast. Rosa squinted her eyes and praised. There are 13 ministers and 1 marshal in the Gray Coat Army. They all have the right to choose. I can guarantee that half of them will choose impartially. Although Josiah has no relevant experience, she is the main person in charge of this publicity plan. The city's liaison organization exists to serve this purpose. So, this is her biggest advantage. Speaking of this, Rosa pointed at Tang In slyly and said, "And you are an important weight." Hee. I heard that the gray space shone brightly in the war a few days ago. Old Marshal Omeng is very envious. Well, just now, Minister Kuan Wei apologized to you and Josiah on behalf of his useless nephew. Because of that, wait for me here. Tang In rubbed his forehead speechlessly. Omeng wanted to duplicate the gray space in the army. Tang In knew about it. Fry even probed about it a few days ago. However, Tang In was focused on Zwafan at that time, so he didn't pay attention to it. Now, it seemed that he couldn't avoid it. As for Kuan Wei, Rosa said it was just a joke. How could a person in a high position make a choice just because of a little apology? However, if he wasn't persuaded by others, there was a chance that he would be biased. Thinking of this, Tang An's heart suddenly moved. He immediately looked at Rosa and said, "Leader, do you believe in me that much?" This question was not groundless. It should be known that Rosa's words before could be regarded as confidences. If it was passed to the ears of Bosco and other people who joined later, it was inevitable that they would have other ideas. Rosa's expression froze, then she smiled indifferently and said, "It's not about trust or not. Although you and Josiah just joined not long ago, I am confident that I still know you. Josiah doesn't need to say much, no matter her thoughts, personality, and so on. She is the young me. She will be more outstanding in the future. As for you," after a pause, Rosa looked at Tang In with a faint smile. Breaking Bull's leg, teaching Quincy a lesson. It can be said that in the Gray Coat Army, except for the gray space and Josiah, you don't care about anything else. Sometimes, when I think about it, it really makes me feel frustrated. I was able to persuade Omen to be the general of the Gray Coat Army for so many years. But I can't do anything to you. Why? It's very simple. You see further than I do. My ideas and principles can't work on you at all. And this is what makes me feel most relieved because you're not interested in power, interests, and so on. Now, it's like a commodity exchange. I give you a platform, and you help me sell things. The profits obtained, we each take what we need, and we don't owe each other anything. Tang In opened his mouth, but in the end, he didn't say anything and acquiesced. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Rosa was indeed the one who led the Gray Coat Army from scratch and stood tall for more than 10 years. She didn't have heaven-defying wisdom, shocking strength, or excellent tactical command, but she had an intuition that could almost see through people's hearts without making people feel afraid. So, she had a group of intelligent managers, the powerful Zwafan, and the battlefield General Omen. There is a more important reason. Do you want to hear it? Rosa smiled and raised her finger, answering her own question. After you joined the Gray Coat Army, you killed countless regular soldiers of the Empire and dozens of nobles of the Empire. You repeatedly robbed military supplies, captured important hostages, and sabotaged the Empire's plans. Tang In looked at Rosa's raised finger and was stunned. Damn it, was there so much? TSK, Tang In, now you have boarded a pirate ship. You even brought your own paddle. You can't turn back now. Rosa patted Tang In's shoulder and said earnestly, "So, you have been plotting against me since the beginning. Don't say that. Which operation didn't you take the initiative to stand out? You don't have to cry." Rosa approached Tang In and said mysteriously, "In view of your outstanding performance, I have decided to give you a reward. Don't forget to look for Marshal Omen later." After saying that, she waved her hand and walked away in a relaxed manner. Tang In touched his nose. In his heart, he was still thinking about how deep the grudge between him and the Bran Empire was. Damn it, when he was running away, where could he hide? Tang In looked up in surprise and saw Josiah standing in front of him, raising her jade-like wrist. I owe you money? Josiah blinked in confusion. What? Didn't you ask me to dance? Tangan turned his head stiffly and looked at Rosa, who had a mischievous look on his face. What the F*** CK? Was this the legendary reward? No matter what, if he denied it now, it would not be a problem of his brain being damaged. It would be a problem of his entire brain being flooded with water. And, yes, it was my treat. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 292. Under everyone's burning gaze, Tang In performed his awkward dance steps, fiddled with his mechanical body, and finally finished the dance while sweating profusely. During the process, he bumped into others 3 times and stepped on Josiah's foot several times. Of course, this was not because he was nervous. Okay, a little bit. The key was that Tang In was not familiar with the dance steps at all. Although his body coordination was excellent, there were very few opportunities to practice. In addition, he had to avoid Josiah's long skirt, so it was normal for him to step on her foot. Fortunately, the awkward moment did not last long. After chatting with the old marshal of the European Union for a while and eating with little Carol, he was led to the back of the hall. It was probably the office of Minister Cunwell. In a small room, Bosco, Omen, and others sat casually. Opposite these people, 2 men and a woman stood side by side, and among them was Josiah, who came first. While Tang In was observing, the ministers also saw him and could not help but show a surprised expression. Then when they saw him sitting on their side, they raised their eyebrows. Bosco and others among them seemed to have thought of something. They glanced at Lhasa, who did not move at all, and their faces changed slightly. Okay, everyone is here. Let's start. After that, Lhasa stood up and pointed at Tang In. By the way, Tang In will also participate in this election and has the right to choose. Sure enough, the ministers had expected it when they saw Tang In, but after Lhasa announced it, they could not help but look at each other. Those who were sitting closer to him were already whispering. Leader. Bosco was the first to stand up. He had secretly prepared a lot for today's election, so he naturally did not want any unexpected changes. Moreover, the relationship between Tang In and Josiah was well known. Just now, Tang In stood up for Josiah. Frowning, Bosco said, "Why didn't I hear this news before? Also, I don't deny Tang In's contribution to the Gray Coat Army, but he doesn't seem to have the right to choose." Although it wasn't pleasant to hear, that was the truth. As for the city's liaison organization, it was almost like establishing a new department. Although the level was not as high as logistics, publicity, and so on, only the ministers were qualified for the leadership election. Sorry, Minister Bosco. Rosa made an apologetic gesture. Tang In was just elected. I just found out. Selection? Bosco's face twitched as he glanced at the other ministers. So, who gave up his right to vote? The so-called election was when a big shot pushed out a person to represent himself. The only ones qualified to do so were the various ministers. However, everyone looked at each other in confusion and shrugged, as if they didn't know what was going on. Bosco's face darkened. Leader, is it not one of us? I'm sorry, I don't mean anything else, but the leader has the right to make decisions, and it can't be transferred to others. Obviously, Bosco thought that Rosa had transferred his rights to Tang In. Rosa waved his hand. You misunderstood. If I transfer the right to vote, then what's the point of this election? Bosco nodded. His face relaxed a little, but the doubts in his heart deepened. Then who is it? Rosa's mouth twitched. Zwafan. The room was so quiet that even a pin drop could be heard. The department heads turned their heads with difficulty and looked at the middle-aged man with a simple face in the corner. Zwafan nodded his head and closed his eyes again. Rosa took the opportunity to say, Now, do you think Tang In is qualified? Was there need to ask? The ministers sighed in their hearts. He was too qualified. Although Zwafan never participated in anything in the base, his role in the Gray Coat Army, his identity, and status were unquestionable. If he was not qualified, everyone could pack up and leave. Zwafan, it was actually Zwafan. Bosco's face kept changing. His chest rose and fell a few times, and finally sat back in his chair. It was no wonder that he was so shocked. Bosco's wisdom and calculation were unquestionable. It could even be said that this old man who was good at scheming in the circle of nobles was definitely the most knowledgeable person among the higher-ups of the Greycoat army. But even so, he still missed out on Zwafan. The reason was simple. Zwafan was just too low-key. Not to mention anything else. Just now, who would have noticed this guy who had no sense of existence in the corner? Different from the shocked crowd, Tang clapped his hands in admiration. Rose's move was too beautiful. Of course, he was lying when he said that he just found out, but he couldn't say anything about it. He could only hold his nose and accept the loss. Tang had indeed been pestering Zwafan for the past few days, so it was natural for them to reach an agreement. She didn't do anything before this, but such a simple and perfect move was enough to disrupt the deployment of some people. It could be said to be a stroke of God. Rosa looked around and said solemnly, "Since there are no objections, I announce that the voting for the person in charge of the city's liaison agency will officially begin. First of all, my right to vote is invalid." After saying that, the room fell into a short silence. Rosa's invalidation of her right to vote was expected by all the ministers. They were just a little confused by the scene just now. They originally had a clear choice in mind, but now they were wavering. Ahem! Tang cleared his throat and stood up first. He bowed to the ministers and then said, "I'm the youngest here, so I'll be the first to speak." The ministers straightened their bodies and listened attentively. Tang was now representing Zwafan, so they had to treat him seriously. "I choose." After a pause, Tang raised his eyebrows playfully at Josiah. After the latter looked at him angrily, he said, "Josiah." Without stopping, he continued, "Josiah is one of the people in charge of the city's publicity plan. She led a team to personally experience it, so she knows the situation inside the city the best. And we know that the city's liaison agency was set up for the publicity plan, so I believe that only Josiah, who knows the details, knows how to make the most of this agency. When it came to intelligence, that was a matter for later." Tang was now firmly holding on to the fact that this agency was set up to support the publicity and sang Josiah's praises. No one could refute him because this was the truth. Rosa looked at the ministers who kept nodding and couldn't help but purse his lips. He secretly thought that he had made the right move by letting Tang join. In contrast, Bosco's face was slightly gloomy, and there was a bitter taste in his mouth. What Tang said was not new, but the key was that he had a vote in the election, and he also had the ability to vaguely influence others. Bosco had previously visited all the ministers present and had achieved some results, but most of them still had an ambiguous attitude. This was originally a situation that they did not have much confidence in, and now that Tang had interfered, the chances were even slimmer. But having said that, they still had to do what they needed to do. After Tang finished speaking, Bosco immediately stood up and clearly supported Enoch. His reason was also persuasive. He avoided publicity and only talked about Enoch's experience and confidence in establishing an agency. Enoch was a civilian official in the Ministry of Supervision in the station. Usually, he was responsible for resolving disputes among the people of the Greycoat army. But when he was still a noble, he was responsible for integrating the various industries of the family and had rich experience in establishing contact agencies. In fact, these words should not have been said by Bosco. After all, his relationship with Enoch was obvious. If it was another minister who said it, the effect would undoubtedly be better. Bosco also had this intention before, but now that he was stimulated by Tang, he could not care less and directly went to the front and explained the advantages in detail. Finally, the atmosphere in the room gradually became lively under the influence of Tang, and Bosco. The impatient Omen directly stood up and announced Josiah's support after Bosco finished speaking. After that, he winked at Tang. The latter naturally touched his nose and accepted this favor. Then the 5 ministers expressed their opinions one after another. There were 3 who supported Josiah and 2 who supported Enoch. In the current situation, The third candidate was directly ignored. Even a minister who was related to him shook his head and simply announced that his choice was invalid. Then Cunwell, who thought for a while, stood up and announced his support for Josiah. It's over, it's over. Bosco completely laid his back on the chair and wiped the sweat on his temples with a gloomy face. Cunwell was one of the people who had an ambiguous attitude before. Although he only represented one vote, to a certain extent, he also represented the choice of other similar people. Damn it. Damn it. The shadow of failure had not dissipated, and the anger in his heart was burning. Bosco lowered his eyelids and looked viciously at Tang, who was sitting there casually with a relaxed expression. Damn kid. First you destroyed my arrangement in the tactics department, then you crippled the experts of my family, and now you snatched the leadership of my important department. You ruined my plans. You ruined my plans. Do you really think I can't kill you? Bosco, who was full of killing intent, suddenly met Tang In's eyes. He was stunned and quickly adjusted his expression and restrained his killing intent. On the other hand, Tang In seemed to have inadvertently glanced at him before. Now that he saw Bosco, he nodded with a smile and was polite. Bosco naturally had to act like a kind old man. He nodded slightly and tried to force a smile on his stiff face. They looked at each other from afar and responded with a smile. It was a calm scene. The difference was that one of them was rolling on the floor and hammering the ground, almost laughing out loud. The other was hugging his head, swallowing his teeth, and almost vomiting blood. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. After a little celebration, Rosa led everyone back to the hall and announced Josiah's appointment and officially announced the start of the city's publicity plan. Needless to say, there was another round of celebration. Josiah was once again surrounded by the crowd, all of them scrambling to congratulate him. However, this had little to do with Tang In. Seeing that little Carol was full, Tang In simply took some pastries and walked out of the door. At this time, it was already night and the moon was high up in the sky. How was it? Did you have fun tonight? Tang In held little Carol's hand, feeling the coolness of the evening breeze blowing against his face. Yes, I'm so full. Little Carol nodded and pouted. Tang In touched his forehead. Besides eating, you don't feel anything else? Huh? Little Carol raised her head, looking innocent and puzzled. Then, as if thinking of something, she tilted her head. Yes, there are 4 exits in the hall, 2 doors and 2 windows. Other than the 8 guards at the front door, there are no exits anywhere else. The security is very low, so you can sneak in. Stop! Tang In was stunned for a moment. He touched his forehead and quickly stopped little Carol's speech. Then he opened his mouth. Sigh. He sighed and gave up helplessly. What a self-inflicted disaster. Tang In scratched his head. Of course, what he wanted to hear wasn't these things discovered with the eyes of an assassin. However, little Carol had been with him for a while now. Under the influence of what he had seen and heard, plus his unintentional teaching, she had integrated his assassin habits into her bones. How could she return to being an ordinary girl like this? Scratching his head, Tang In felt his head hurt again. He did want to improve little Carol's strength, but he didn't want her personality to become as cold as ice. But then again, wasn't this personality more suitable for an assassin? Headache. To be honest, Tang In really didn't have any experience in taking care of a child. Usually, when they were together, the most they talked about was how to improve their cultivation. Tang In wanted to teach little Carol some of his combat experience and escape methods, so that she could master more combat and survival methods. But he didn't realize that these things had a strong assassin flavor, cold-blooded, direct. Under the influence of such a style, how could little Carol act like someone her age? What a failure. If this continues, will I become another Zwafan? No, I definitely can't do this, but assassin habits. An assassin's habit? Tang In, who was muttering to himself, suddenly had a thought. After thinking about it, he made up his mind. Ahem. Carol, do you know what a real assassin should be like? Little Carol blinked and touched her lips with her fingers, as if thinking. Kill people. That's a specialty. Anything else? Kill a lot of people. Little Carol pondered for a while and gave a rather domineering answer. It's like this. Tang In wisely gave up on the method of persuasion and said directly, someone told me that killing is only the inevitable result. What's important is the process. Well, you have to remember this. Forget it. Don't remember it. Killing people is easy. You just need to swipe a dagger across the throat. The real difficulty is how to approach silently or openly. I've taught you a lot of combat skills. Now let's talk about disguise. Disguise mainly depends on two forms. One is props, and the other is yourself. I'll teach you how to make props in the future, but you have to remember that these things are ultimately external. The key is still yourself, because you can't dress up as a farmer and pinch a crystal wine glass with 2 fingers. Well, you're lacking in this aspect. For example, if the target isn't a lively party like just now, how would you approach and kill him? You have to know that with your cold face, anyone with eyes will notice you. I can wait for him to come home, Little Carol said after thinking for a while. Tang In froze and then pinched his chin. That's a way, but assassination is sometimes not up to you. What if your employer insists that you do it on such an occasion? In that case, you can only dress up as someone who matches the target's identity to get close. But with your personality and expression, it's obvious that you won't get along. You don't believe me? Then let's do a simple one. Will you laugh? Brother Tang In. Little Carol immediately raised her head and grinned, revealing a bright smile. Not to me, but to others in... Tang In curled his lips. When you smile, you should look into the other person's eyes first, not take the opportunity to aim at the throat, the forehead. Little Carol stuck out her tongue and lowered her head in embarrassment. Of course, she wasn't thinking about assassinating Tang In. This was purely a habit. See, you can't even do the most basic control of your expression, let alone change your temperament. Assassin. Well, for a profession like an assassin, as long as you can kill, the means don't matter. You have to play to the advantage of your gender. Forget about seduction. It's too early. What you need to do is to restore your original appearance. You know, not many people will guard against a teenage girl with a sweet smile. Little Carol lowered her head and followed Tang In silently, as if digesting the meaning of these words. Stopping, Tang In turned his head and said, "So, you don't have to participate in the gray space training after this. I'll give you a week to observe the movements, expressions, and so on of everyone you meet in the station and figure out their mentality and emotions. Also, you have to greet 1,000 strangers and make at least 10 friends of the same age." Got it. Little Carol bit her lip and nodded. These requirements sounded simple and easy, and he believed that any ordinary person could do it. But for Little Carol, it was really a challenge. However, her advantage was that after knowing that it would help her, she would have enough perseverance to do it. Of course, this character could be described as stubborn, and she wouldn't turn back until she hit the wall. I don't know if this decision is right or wrong. Tang In touched Little Carol's hair. He really had no way to let Little Carol naturally restore her original appearance. After thinking about it, he could only rely on the assassin disguise training because it could at least make her look normal on the surface. Okay, let's go home. Okay, Little Carol responded and then frowned. Brother Tang In, after I saw Josiah take your flower at the party, she said something. Well, I don't understand. Oh, you're starting to observe and figure it out so soon? Tang In chuckled and then asked curiously, what did she say? She said, idiot. Little Carol hesitated for a moment and decided to ask the question in her heart. Although there was no sound, Sister Joshua's mouth did say those 2 words. Why? Didn't you help Sister Josiah? Why did she scold you instead? He paused and fell silent. The crescent moon was like a hook, sprinkling a clear light that couldn't reach the corner of the wall. The night wind whistled like a knife, cutting the bonfire in the distance and crackling. A roar sounded. She really said that? She really said that. F***CK Public morals are really degenerating day by day, and people's hearts are not what they used to be. If you have any opinions, just say it. I'm a very easy person to talk to. What's the point of scolding people behind their backs? No, tomorrow I'll go find that Quint and kneel in front of her to sing Conquer. I don't believe that I can't disgust her to death. Sorry, there's something wrong with my body. It's not serious, but it's very annoying. I'll stop writing here today. And, sorry again. Civic Cat, to be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 294. The next day, morning. The warm sun rose, and the chill quickly receded. It was a rare good day, in a corner of the station. Why you go away? Are you scaring me, I want to find Mom. Mom, about 8 or 9 children in their teens stood nervously. Some are sobbing, and some are wailing. In the middle of them stood a girl who was also in her teens. She was holding half a brick in her hand. At this time, her expression was a little blank and aggrieved behind a corner not far away. Tang, Un's expression twitched slightly. The person standing in the middle of the children was little Carol. Under Tang, Un's persuasion last night, she didn't follow David and the others to do morning exercises today. Instead, she got up early and wandered around the station. Tang In followed behind and watched her nervously clench her fists and grab her clothes by the side of the road. Then she took a few deep breaths, as if she had made an important decision, and walked toward a peasant woman who had gotten up early. However, before she could say anything, the peasant woman saw her first and greeted her with a smile. Good morning. This was a very normal greeting, but it made little Carol lose all her courage. She ran away quickly like a rabbit shot by an arrow, leaving the peasant woman with a big mouth standing there in a daze after her first battle failed. Little Carol continued to wander around the station. Her mouth opened and closed silently. Judging from the shape of her mouth, she seemed to be saying, Auntie, good morning. Uncle, good morning. From time to time, she would make a cooperative smile on her face. Yes, she should be practicing. Then she said in front of a young woman, Auntie, good morning. Not to mention how wonderful that woman's expression was, how broken she was. Little Carol once again fled in defeat. After that, she ran into this group of excited children who seemed to be discussing where to go to play. Little Carol had a mission to make 10 friends of the same age. With these half-grown children, she didn't feel much pressure, so she walked up directly. The two of them talked for a while, but the situation didn't seem too good. This was understandable. No matter who it was, if they met someone on the street who directly wanted to be friends with an icy expression, their subconscious reaction would be confusion and resistance. Of course, this wasn't absolute. If it had been Josiah, it would have been possible. However, although little Carol was also a little beauty, she didn't have that kind of friendly and gentle aura, nor did she have the aura of someone who was naturally familiar with others. Of course, the effect wasn't ideal. Seeing that the negotiation between the two sides was about to break down, little Carl looked left and right, walked to the corner, and picked up a brick that was about to be discarded. And he came after we finished training. I didn't dare to ask. It seems like he was waiting for you. David's expression was slightly awkward as he whispered. David had always been a fool. It was unknown whether it was his talent or his nerves. He was the only person in the gray space who could resist Tang Un's killing intent. But even so, looking at Zhuofan's face that seemed to have never changed in 10,000 years and thinking about the recent harassment, he suddenly felt a lot of pressure. Tang Un was delighted when he heard this. Could it be that things had taken a turn for the better? He raised his eyebrows and walked forward to greet him. Good morning. Zhuofan had already seen Tang In and nodded when he saw him come over. This was his unique way of greeting people. In, are you looking for me for something? Tang In concluded that it was better to be direct when dealing with people like this. Otherwise, while you were chattering away, he would be able to take a nap. Zhuofan nodded again. His lips moved slightly, but it seemed like he hadn't organized his words and closed them again. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Even though Tang In was a patient person, he couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Fortunately, he wasn't an impatient person. Otherwise, he might have vomited blood. Finally, a voice sounded. I promise you. Tang didn't even have time to ridicule Zwafan before he could squeeze out these few words. Promise? Promise what? What I need you to promise. Fortunately, Tang's reaction was quick. He immediately recalled his previous thoughts and suppressed the joy in his heart. He said in disbelief, You promise to be the assistant teacher of the gray space. It was easy to answer the question. Zwafan nodded lightly. Ha. Tang put his hands on his hips and laughed loudly. His voice echoed for miles. Damn, it wasn't easy. Even though Tang had expected this, he still couldn't help but feel excited when he heard the answer. These few days, he had been pestering them day and night. Not only was Zwafan annoyed, but Tang and the others were even more tired. Even so, he didn't plan to give up. He even had a plan in mind. In the morning, he would train against a group of people in the army and continue pestering them in the afternoon. Even though he wasn't clear about the situation and had somehow succeeded, it was still a success. How could he not be overjoyed? At this moment, Zwafan spoke again. You have to promise me as well. Huh? Tang suppressed his laughter. He was startled when he heard this. He then probed. You mean there are prerequisites for agreeing to be the assistant teacher? Zwafan nodded. No problem. Tang agreed without hesitation. He waved his hand generously. Just say it. What do you want? Or do you want us to do something? Don't worry. No matter how outrageous or unethical it is, it won't be a problem. Zwafan nodded and looked around. He then looked at the members of the gray space not far away. Finally, his eyes met with Tang's. Oh, what do you mean? Tang imitated Zwafan and looked around. He was a little confused. Zwafan's lips moved. However, after he said this word, he looked around anxiously. Tang was also anxious. He scratched his head. What exactly am I? Zwafan frowned slightly. He seemed to have thought of something and nodded as if to express his apology. Then he grabbed Tang by the shoulder, and with a whoosh, he soared into the air. F***CK. Tang, who was completely unprepared, was shocked. As soon as he opened his mouth, a gust of wind rushed into his mouth. He immediately closed his mouth and looked at the stunned David and the others below. They were getting smaller and farther away. What's going on? Can't you give me a hint? Do you have to be so sudden? However, when he looked at the city below and the greenery connecting the mountains in the distance, TSK, is this flying? It feels pretty good. Zwafan didn't fly for long. He slowly landed on a mound a few kilometers away from the city. When he touched the ground, perhaps because of the surrounding environment, Zwafan opened his mouth again. Sorry, this place is not suitable for talking. Oh, Tang nodded subconsciously. However, he was immediately startled. Wait a minute. You brought me here from the city because there was someone beside us? Zwafan nodded. Tang rubbed his forehead. He was almost speechless. Big brother, just say it. I'll just let David and the others leave. Why do you have to do this? Seeing Zwafan's calm expression, Tang helplessly shrugged and gave up. Okay, then we'll talk here. And what's the matter? Zwafan's expression changed. He seemed to be hesitating. Finally, he said, I saw your performance at the gathering last night. Very good. Last night? Gathering? Tang shook his head and asked directly, What kind of performance is it? What does it have to do with your request? It's about Josiah's performance, and it has something to do with it. Zwafan seemed to relax a little. He continued, You seem to be good at dealing with women. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 295. Cough. That dish can be eaten carelessly, but words can't. Although this was a compliment that all men wanted to hear, Tang still subconsciously chose to be modest after regaining his senses. However, halfway through his sentence, he suddenly reacted and probed, You mean, you want me to help you chase after a woman? I'm just giving you some advice. Zwafan's expression returned to normal. However, Tang's observation was very sharp. Zuofan's ears and neck turned red as if they were cooked. Of course, he wouldn't say this. He looked away and said excitedly, "You should have said so earlier. I'm really good at this." Ignoring Zuofan's suspicious gaze, Tang sighed in his heart. Zuofan was also chasing after girls? If he wasn't wrong, this should be his first time. Could he be? Ahem. It seemed that no matter how strong an expert was, he couldn't get past a beauty. But who was it? Rosa? Without a doubt, anyone who was familiar with Zuofan would think of Rosa. After all, he had been protecting Rosa for more than 10 years. Who is the target? I'm not trying to find out, but I need to know who it is so that I can come up with a plan. Tang acted like a professional love expert. He didn't try to pry open Zuofan's mouth. He only emphasized, "I just need some advice." That's difficult. Tang rubbed his chin. He was in a difficult position. You can't think of anything? How could that be? Tang obviously wouldn't miss this opportunity. His mind was spinning rapidly. Soon, he came up with an idea. Since we don't know Rosa, the target's personality, we can start with you. If you don't mind, is she familiar with your personality? Yes, Zuofan answered without hesitation. It must be Rosa. Tang patted his head to get rid of his nosy thoughts. He continued his analysis. Since she is familiar with you, you should be confident. There was no doubt about this. With Zuofan's personality, if he wasn't absolutely confident, he wouldn't have come to Tang for advice. Then it's easy. Women like romance. What instruments do you know? That can't be. What about painting? You won't. Tang suggested all sorts of ways to express himself, but Zuofan kept shaking his head. In the end, Tang helplessly covered his face and said, "Big brother, you have to know at least one of the 4 arts, right?" It turned out that Zuofan didn't know anything other than his strength. Could it be that this thing also needed a gunner? But if it was Rosa, he would be able to see through it easily. After thinking for a while, Zuofan said hesitantly, "I know a little about carving. I use it when practicing the sword." As expected, with Zuofan's personality, as long as he was interested in something, he would definitely do his best to study it. There was no doubt that Zuofan had devoted all his attention to martial arts for the first half of his life. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had such strength. Tang perked up when he heard that. It's good that you know something. If you're not familiar with it, you can learn it slowly. Carving. Well, I suggest that you carve a small wooden carving in her image. Later on, you can carve some words on it to express your love. This kind of slow progress that doesn't require words is very suitable for you. Zuofan's eyes lit up when he heard that. He nodded thoughtfully. What a pitiful expert. Tang sighed when he saw this. Although his personality had changed, he knew that he wasn't good at picking up girls. But no matter what, he could still think of small tricks to win the hearts of girls. But Zuofan, he had almost turned into a block of wood when it came to martial arts. If Tang had felt some respect for Zuofan before, it had now turned into sympathy and understanding. It turned out that experts were also people of flesh and blood. They also had emotions, and they also had flaws. He also had flaws. This had nothing to do with his shocking strength. Take Zuofan, for example. In the eyes of the people in the encampment, he always represented the image of an aloof, calm, and cold expert. But who knew that behind this coldness was actually a wooden personality and a language barrier? That's right, it was a language barrier. Combined with Rose's evaluation, Tang could now confirm that Zuofan had this problem. It had to be known that even though Zuofan appeared calm when talking to a man, Tang could still feel the bone-deep nervousness. So, it was even more difficult to talk about women. After understanding this, Tang was even more concerned about little Carol's current situation. He didn't want little Carol to become like this in the future. After all, although everyone loved beautiful women, if he racked his brains to sweet-talk her in exchange for a cold expression, even if he knew she didn't mean it, he would still be speechless. After settling Zuofan's matter, the Gray Space's teaching assistant position was finally settled. Both sides agreed that Zuofan would take 2 hours every afternoon to teach David and the others how to use battle energy. Tang began to look forward to it. With a great expert like Zhuo Fan joining, wouldn't the gray space's strength soar? Waha! I don't want anyone else to know about this. Zhuo Fan spoke again, just as Tang and was lost in his thoughts. Still shy? Top quality, man. Ahem. Tang and cleared his throat and smiled. How about 3 hours? I like to talk in my sleep. Yeah. While speaking, his body suddenly turned cold. Then, an extremely sharp aura instantly rose in front of him. Sword? Energy? Damn! The illusions overlapped, and Tang Un's figure instantly retreated a few meters. He hurriedly waved his hand. Don't get too excited. Don't get too excited. I was just joking. The sword energy disappeared. Zhuo Fan probably knew that he was making a big fuss out of nothing and nodded apologetically. Damn, you can't afford to hurt a slow person. Feeling a thin layer of cold sweat on his back, Tang and let out a long sigh. He didn't doubt that if he had explained too slowly, the real attack would have instantly arrived. Of course, Zhuo Fan didn't want to kill him. It was just a subconscious reaction. It was like a shy person who was exposed in front of everyone would immediately cover the other person's mouth and stop them from speaking. As for Zhuo Fan, it was just that his reaction was a bit more intense and the power was a bit more unbearable. Let's go back, Tang In carefully said. In his heart, Zhuo Fan was a ticking time bomb. Moreover, he was a high-level voice-controlled item. No, he had to go back and explain to David and the others. If he died like this, it would be a waste. Zhuo Fan glanced at Tang In, nodded, and soared into the sky. Tang In opened his mouth and slowly raised his head. He watched as the figure gradually rose into the sky and shrank. Hey, you left someone behind, but there's still me. Even though Tang Un was shouting from below, Zhuo Fan still left without looking back. In a short moment, his figure became an inconspicuous little black. Damn, so what if you can fly? Revenge, absolute revenge. Tang In angrily waved his fist. Zhuo Fan's actions were definitely revenge for their pestering a few days ago. Don't think that I don't know that the person you like is Rosa. Be careful that I don't expose you when we get back. Of course, these words were said in a fit of anger. Tang In didn't want a golden sword energy to come crashing down and flatten the hill he was on. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 296. As mentioned before, in Tang In's opinion, Zhuo Fan's personality was actually a good person. Although Zhuo Fan had abandoned him on a lonely hill, Zhuo Fan still had a sense of propriety. This place was only a few dozen li away from the encampment. With Tang In's speed, he could return in 10 minutes. If he had landed on a mountain peak a few hundred kilometers away, that would have been a huge joke. After a while, when Tang In returned to the eastern gate, the members of the gray space were still waiting there. Boss! Seeing Tang In appear, David and the others surrounded him, unable to hide their excitement. When Zhuo Fan and Tang Un were talking, they had been on the side and knew what was going on. But when they heard Zhuo Fan's request, the two of them suddenly flew away. During this time, David and the others had been very restless, as if hundreds of cat claws were scratching their hearts. The guidance of a void realm cultivator. This kind of opportunity was really hard to come by. Once they obtained it, their strength would definitely increase qualitatively. But at the same time, they were a bit worried. Everyone knew that if they wanted to obtain something, they had to pay a price. With such a big opportunity, Zhuo Fan's request should not be low. Tang In naturally knew what everyone was thinking. He glanced at them with a strange expression and thought, if Zhuo Fan's request to pick up girls is made, will their expressions collapse? TSK. I'm really looking forward to it. Of course, this was just a thought. Tang In wouldn't say it, he didn't dare to say it. Thinking of this, he lost interest in teasing them and simply said, cough, cough. Practice well. Don't waste this opportunity. After saying this, he left with his hands behind his back, looking like an indifferent master. Tang In was first shaken by David's howl. but then he couldn't help digging his ears in the midst of cheers. "Ha ha! Gods above, thank you to your entire family." Not far away, the people who were building the city walls were also startled by the sudden explosion. They came back to their senses and looked down at the dozens of people who were either pounding their chests and stamping their feet or howling with their arms around each other's shoulders. Outside the southern city gate, there were continuous hills and rugged mountain roads. There were a few battlefields for hypothetical confrontations. The main one was outside the east city gate. However, fights were held there almost every day, so it was obviously not suitable for small-scale training. Therefore, after Omeng had the idea of replicating the gray space, he had drawn out an area outside the southern city gate. By the time Tang In and the others arrived, there were already about 60 to 70 people gathered and waiting. A burly, bald man came up to him with a big laugh. "Ha, Captain Twain, long time no see. Big brother Titan?" David rushed out with large strides amidst a cry of surprise. The two men hugged each other heavily in the middle of the crowd, their muscles bulging. Tang In was slightly surprised. He looked at the crowd and quickly recognized a few familiar faces. Titan was the person Tang In and the others met in the mine when they were being chased. Titan had fought with David before, but it was an exchange of blows that led to friendship. The two had formed a deep friendship during their escape from the mine. However, after returning to the outpost, Tang Un had never seen him again. He did hear Fry mention it once when they were drinking, and his tone was regretful. When Fry and the others were preparing to travel 1,000 miles to behead the unscrupulous nobles, it was Titan who led the soldiers to guard the camp. In the end, after the incident, Titan was used as a scapegoat. He went through military law and was directly thrown into prison. Later on, the two of them coincidentally met in Lord Solomon's mine. To be honest, after so many years, Fry felt sorry for Titan who had suffered such an unexpected calamity. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken the risk to save Titan from Tang Un's killing intent. Later on, after joining the Gray Coat Army, Fry invited Titan and a few of his old brothers to join the spear formation breaking team, but Titan and the others refused. Now, it seemed that Titan had some pride and arrogance. He also joined the Gray Coat Army as a lowly soldier. Even so, his strength and commanding ability were all there for all to see. Naturally, he did well. After all, Omeng had high hopes for this group of people. For Titan to join them and greet them as a platoon leader meant something in itself. After greeting everyone one by one, Titan said, "Captain Tang In, what David and the others did has spread throughout the army. Now, there are 65 of us here, and we've been ordered to ask for your guidance." Tang In chuckled and waved his hand. "Ha, big brother Titan is older than me. Besides, we've been through life and death together. That's why you could just call me Tang In." Titan didn't stand on ceremony. After exchanging a few more words, he suddenly took a step forward and said in a low voice, "Tang In, I was appointed as a platoon leader at the last minute. Most of the people in the platoon are the elites of the various armies. Some of them were originally platoon leaders. Well, they're not convinced by the gray space." Tang In raised his eyebrows when he heard this. He was somewhat enlightened. After all, the gray space and the army were two different systems. Even though David and the others had shown brilliantly in the previous battle, paralyzing almost an entire regiment of soldiers and causing everyone to gasp in admiration, that wasn't the case. However, not everyone would think this way. The armies of this world had always been particular about decisive battles in the wilderness, large-scale battles. It was still acceptable to use tricks and tricks. After all, this was within the scope of battle tactics. However, there were only a few dozen people, and they had even used methods of infiltration to capture people. It was inevitable that they would give people the impression of being wretched and unpresentable. Moreover, most of these people were the elites of their respective platoons. Some of them were even directly leading a platoon. Capable people would naturally be arrogant. It was reasonable for them to look down on the methods of the gray space. However, understanding didn't mean that they had to accept it. Tang In narrowed his long and narrow eyes and nodded with a smile, Well, thank you for the reminder, Big Brother Titan. Haha, it's good that you're not convinced. We specialize in dealing with all kinds of dissatisfaction. Hee hee. The members of the gray space behind him laughed sinisterly. David patted Titan's shoulder casually. Don't worry, Big Brother Titan. We won't hold back later. Hee hee, if anyone else refuses to accept you as their platoon leader, I'll beat them up. Titan shook his head when he heard this and laughed bitterly. He was also a proud person. Why would he need an outsider to help him suppress his platoon members? This was what David had said, and he knew that David had always been straightforward. He didn't even think before he spoke. Otherwise, if it were someone else, Titan might not even pay attention to them. All right, let's go over. With that, Tang led the way to the crowd. When the people there saw Tang in and the others coming over, they looked at each other. Most of them didn't deliberately arrange themselves in formation. It wasn't until Titan returned and yelled at them that they reluctantly got into formation. Of course, there were many disapproving expressions on their faces. They were all elites of their respective armies. When they were gathered together, they were very excited. They thought that this might be a chance for them to further their studies and learn how to use tactics by the side of a high-ranking officer. But who would have thought that in the end, they would learn some sneak attacks from the gray space? The huge difference between their expectations and reality naturally made them feel conflicted. Tang didn't get angry. He chuckled and stood still. The members of the gray space lined up behind him and said seriously, "Hello everyone, this is the first time we meet. Let's introduce ourselves. My name is Tang N, the platoon leader of the gray space. I'll also be your instructor for the next few days." After a pause, he continued, "First of all, I'll make one thing clear. I won't teach you things that you've memorized. You just have to remember one thing. Since you're here, this is a battlefield. I'll teach you things that are truly suitable for the battlefield." After that, "Hello, instructor." "Hello." Sparse sounds could be heard, as if there were crows cawing in the night. Titan's face darkened. The people behind him who were shouting looked at each other, feeling awkward. "Is this your attitude towards your instructor?" Tang narrowed his long eyes. "Or do you think that I'm not competent enough as your instructor? Are you dissatisfied?" There was silence in the room. No one answered. However, most of them had a cold and distant look on their faces. It was a look that said, "You're talking nonsense." The corner of Tang Un's mouth twitched slightly. He spoke again with a sarcastic tone. "You don't even have the courage to question me face to face? Or did the military just give me a bunch of ignorant mutes?" Reporting, "We're not mutes, and we're not ignorant." A young man in bronze armor walked out from the group. He raised his head and met Tang Un's eyes. Every word he said was cold. "We just think that you can't teach us anything useful." Tang Un's face was calm. "Then what do you think is useful?" The young man said without hesitation, "Troop formation, command and dispatch, strategy and tactics." "That's quite comprehensive." Tang Un nodded and continued. "Then I'll ask again. What's the purpose of learning these things?" "Is there a need to ask?" "Of course it's to kill the enemy and defeat them." The young man's tone was somewhat disdainful. He seemed to think that this question was too stupid. "Well said." Tang Un unexpectedly gave him a thumbs up. His tone was full of praise. Titan frowned when he heard this. He wanted to remind him, but it was inconvenient for him to speak. The military was complicated, but it was also very simple. There was only one principle. As long as your fist was big enough and you were brave enough to kill the enemy, you would be the boss. When Titan reminded Tang In before, it was not without the intention of letting the other party show off his skills and directly subdue them with violence. However, now Tang In was doing the opposite. It seemed that he wanted to rely on these soft methods of praise to blend in with everyone. In Titan's opinion, this was naturally not a good idea. Just as he was getting anxious, Tang In asked in return, "Since you know that the purpose is to defeat the enemy, then does the previous achievement of paralyzing an entire regiment in the gray space not count?" Everyone was stunned. They stood there in a daze. Yes, the purpose of learning tactics was to defeat the enemy. Now, there were only a few dozen people in the gray space, but the effect was heaven-defying. Was this not something they should learn? That's not right. The young man came back to his senses and immediately refuted loudly. These two are not the same thing. They can't be compared at all. Besides, the gray space only won by surprise last time. They can do it a few more times. After familiarizing themselves with this style, the enemy will naturally be prepared. Ridiculous. Childish. Tang finally showed a look of contempt. He said disdainfully, "A few more times? Do you think we're playing with military flags? On the battlefield, only one time is enough to determine life and death. Besides, I'm here purely because of old Marshal Omeng's invitation. Perhaps you think that your foresight is good enough. However, in comparison, I think that the Marshal and the General's discussion results are more reliable." After taking a few deep breaths, the young man's face turned green and white. He seemed to be suppressing his anger. He said directly, "Captain Tang Yin, I admit that you're very strong. However, I don't think that you understand tactics, nor do I think that you have the qualifications to be our instructor. I request to withdraw. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 297. I don't think you know battle tactics, and I don't think you're qualified to be our instructor. I request to withdraw. After that, the young man straightened his back and saluted, then turned and left. Whether it was because he couldn't argue with him or because he didn't want to argue with him, it didn't matter. What was important was the young man's attitude. "I want to withdraw. I'm not interested in what you're doing." There was a small commotion in the crowd. The Greycoat Army had 4 divisions in total, and this young man belonged to the 2nd Division. With him leading the way, the soldiers in the same division naturally lifted their feet and walked out. Titan looked anxious. He didn't want to see his team disband before it was formed. Besides, if so many people left, where would Tang Yin put his face? Just as he was about to say something to dissuade him, Titan's heart skipped a beat, and he shut his mouth, because he saw that behind Tang Yin, David and the others were looking at him with disdain and watching a good show. "I don't agree." A clear voice sounded in the field. Tang Yin's expression was still calm. Hesitation flashed across the faces of the soldiers in the team, and they subconsciously slowed down. The young man's body trembled, and he slowly turned his head. His expression was gloomy and somewhat sarcastic. "What? Captain Tang Yin wants to force us to stay." Shaking his head, Tang Yin pursed his lips. "To be honest, I really hope that you can all leave at once. That way, it'll be quieter." But he paused, and his long and narrow eyes narrowed. "But you seem to have forgotten that I said in the first sentence. Since you're here, this is a battlefield. On the battlefield, you can leave if you want, but you have to lie down, because you're already a deserter." The young man's heart tightened. He clenched his fists and made a defensive posture, but then he shrugged and loosened his fists. His face was full of undisguised mockery. "I admit that I'm not your opponent. If Captain Tang Yin wants to fight, I'll take you on." "Huh? Fight?" Tang Yin tilted his head contemptuously. "You think too highly of yourself. Fighting cowards and deserters will only dirty my hands." The young man's face immediately turned red, and he pointed a finger. "You lie down." Without waiting for him to speak, an explosive shout exploded. The young man's expression changed, and his pupils dilated instantly. It was as if he had fallen into icy water 1,000 meters below the surface, and the pressure from all directions surged toward him. Pong! He first knelt on one knee, then fell backwards. Ah! A humiliating roar was heard. The young man's body trembled violently. A faint red light circulated around his body. Both of his hands clawed the ground as if he wanted to stand up. However, it was as if there was a mountain pressing down on his body. No matter how tight his muscles and pulsating his blood vessels, he could not move an inch. The surrounding soldiers gasped when they saw this. They did not know what was going on. He only saw Tang Yin cry out and then fall down. What kind of attack was this? On the other hand, Titan had a strange expression on his face as he rubbed his nose awkwardly. Tang Yin's strength seemed to have become stronger. He knew how the young man felt, because he had experienced it personally before, and it was even stronger than this. Murderous intent, thud, thud, thud. He took 3 consecutive steps. Tang walked in front of the young man and looked down at him. Do you want to do it a few more times? You can guard against it. This was undoubtedly a response to the young man's previous words. However, he was sweating profusely now, and it was difficult for him to speak. Tang instructor. A soldier of the Second Army ran out and wanted to plead for mercy. However, when he saw Tang En's empty eyes that seemed to devour everything, he felt a chill in his heart and could not continue speaking. He now seemed to understand a little of what the young man on the ground was feeling. Seeing your comrade in distress, you stepped forward bravely. Not bad, you have some guts. Tang glanced at the soldier and praised him. Then he stepped back and retracted his murderous intent. Huff, huff. The young man panted heavily, like a fish that had returned to the water. After being helped up by his companions, he still could not hide the fear on his face. Glancing at the shocked soldiers, Tang said indifferently, I hope you understand that fighting is like killing people. There's not only one way to do it. Some techniques and combat methods do not exist and have no power just because you don't know or don't want to know. Everyone looked at the young man and fell silent again. However, although they did not speak, there was no longer any contempt on their faces at this time. Tang nodded with satisfaction. It did not matter if they were convinced or not. As long as they were willing to listen, it was a good start. Of course, anyone could talk big. I believe that you are not willing to accept it now. Tang turned his head and looked into the distance. Then he pointed to a hill about 10 miles away and said, Do you see the highest hill? The one with only one tree. Everyone narrowed their eyes and nodded. 5 people from the gray space, including your entire team. No matter what method you use, whoever reaches the tree first wins. Well, you can go first. After that, Tang looked at the excited soldiers and curled his lips. Don't say that I didn't give you a chance. If you want to prove that I am not qualified to be an instructor, use your actions to speak for themselves. Of course, if you lose, don't ever mention tactics in front of me again. What if we win? A soldier in the team mustered up his courage and shouted, Hee hee. Tang raised his eyebrows and looked at the soldier with a half-smile. I don't think there is a need to answer your question. Whoosh, contempt, indifference. They could interpret it any way they wanted because it did not seem to be too much. The soldiers' faces turned red. They were angry. No matter what, they were the best of the best in their respective armies. Although the gray space was famous, there was no need to be so arrogant. Previously, they were still hesitant to fight with more than 60 people against 5 people, because even if they won, it would be an unfair victory. But now this thought was instantly thrown to the back of their minds. Their hearts were filled with the desire for revenge, and they were just waiting for 10 minutes to slap Tang in the face with their undisguised battle results and the most contemptuous tone. Just as the soldiers were quickly discussing countermeasures and were about to set off, Tang turned his head and said, Who wants to come out and play? David and the others looked at each other and shook their heads. David kept retreating. I'm not going. There's no point in bullying these rookies. Besides, Titan is inside. I can't do it. Speechless, Tang turned his gaze to Michaud, who frowned and said reluctantly, Fine, count me in. There's still 4 left. Hurry up. Well, Harry looked around and suggested, Why don't we play rock, paper, scissors? Whoever loses will go. Objection. David was the first to raise his hand in objection. Rock, paper, scissors was not just a contest of wits, but also a contest of reaction time. David knew that he had no advantage in either aspect and was bound to lose. Objection overruled. I agree. Luke chuckled. Me too. F*CKU. David's objection was ignored. The members of the gray space skillfully split into teams and started rock, paper, scissors. While they were having fun, the soldiers who hadn't left yet were dumbfounded. When they came back to themselves, almost all of their faces were twisted. They gritted their teeth and wanted to swallow David and the others whole. Let's go. The corners of Titan's eyes twitched. In the end, He smiled bitterly and ran to the front. The soldiers behind him took one last deep look at the members of the gray space who were playing rock, paper, scissors, and their resentment soared to the sky. Who do you think you are? See how I'll slap your faces later. 3 minutes later. Damn it, you King tricked me. David roared and retreated from the battle with a gloomy face. He went to Michaud's side. In the end, Michaud, David, and 3 other members who joined the second batch were chosen. That's enough? You must accept your loss. Well, don't be careless. The corner of Tang Un's mouth twitched. Among this group of people, Harry's brain was undoubtedly the most active. He suggested rock, paper, scissors because he saw Luke's intention to ruthlessly humiliate these elite soldiers. If you want to rise, you have to suppress it first. If he wanted to really tame these soldiers, he had to use some tricks. Yes, boss. David and the others turned and ran with serious expressions. Whether they had joined before or after, they all knew Tang Un's temper. It didn't matter how much they looked down on him before the battle, but once they started, they would definitely go all out. Huff, huff. In the continuous mountain range, Titan led 5 people to the top of the mountain. After a few breaths, he looked back and then ran down the mountain without hesitation. Stimulated by the previous battle, they entered a state of rapid sprinting from the beginning. Along the way, except for a few steep hills that were not worth climbing, almost all of them ran in a straight line. To be honest, Titan didn't want to win. He had been on the battlefield for a long time, so naturally, he could see Tang Un's intention to suppress them. But in the current situation, he couldn't go easy on them even if he wanted to, because beside him were not only his old brothers, but also 2 other people from the army. The team had just been formed, and as a platoon leader, he didn't have much authority yet. Naturally, he couldn't order these people to go easy on them. It wasn't that he didn't trust David and the others. Titan knew that if it was just a race, anyone from the gray space could win. But now, only a few of them were running because the others were guarding the various points responsible for intercepting David and the others. In this way, the situation was difficult to predict. The journey was only about 10 miles. Although the road was difficult, if they ran at full speed, they could reach it in less than half an hour. In such a short time, could they shake off the obstacles and catch up? This worry didn't last long. After 25 minutes, Titan and the others were only about 10 meters away from the top of the target hill. At this time, they didn't even see the shadows of the gray space members. One of the veterans gave Titan a look and then looked at the 2 soldiers who were beaming with joy. His meaning was clear. He was thinking about whether or not to create an accident and drag them down the hill. This was easy to do as long as they slipped and grabbed them. Titan pondered for a moment, but still shook his head. These soldiers had seen his relationship with Tang In and the others. If he played tricks now, it would be easy for them to see through it. Ha, phew. Crazy. You're King crazy. The other soldiers in the army were excited. They used their hands and feet to climb up, panting as they shouted, "I can't wait to slap their faces." Ugh. With such a short distance, they naturally climbed up in the time it took them to talk. But when they poked their heads out, they found that there were already people enjoying the shade under the trees. A few of them were even yawning, looking over in boredom. Pah! The small rock shattered. The soldier who spoke earlier was so shocked that he lost his grip. His body leaned back and looked like he was about to fall. Fortunately, the one behind him was Titan. He lifted him up with one hand, and with a low shout, he threw him up forcefully. Phew! Looking down from above, the soldier finally confirmed that the gray space members were all there. And behind them, there were 50 to 60 people tied up. It should be the people they sent to intercept them. That's right. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 298. It was just a contest of strength. Moreover, there were no injured people here, so there was no need to do any post-battle matters. At the top of the hill, the soldiers stood upright in the cold wind. Their expressions were extremely complicated. depression, unwillingness, shame, all kinds of emotions gathered together. They could probably be described with a common word, and that was humiliation. Originally, although there were no high-ranking officers standing here, they were all elites in their respective squads. Among them, there was no lack of ruthless people who could kill several enemies on the battlefield without batting an eyelid. There were also those who commanded their squads to ambush on the spot when they were heavily surrounded. Then, they would explode in one go and destroy the enemy's war supplies on a large scale. It could be said that those who were selected had their own glorious histories. As long as they did not die, their bright future was still guaranteed. But now, they were defeated and in a complete mess. Some of them even had reasons such as not being good at cooperation, not being good at this kind of fighting style, and so on. They were too ashamed to mention it, because they were defeated by the 5 people selected by the other party as if it was child's play. Moreover, it was under the full force of their own side. If there was anything more humiliating than this, it would be the attitude of a victor. Don't misunderstand. Tang In and the members of the Gray Space did not look down on them. They did not even look at them with contempt. They just chatted under the tree. From time to time, there would be laughter and banter. However, this was the greatest humiliation to them. Their side had suffered such a crushing defeat, but the victor did not have the slightest expression of excitement on his face. What did this mean? To put it nicely, it meant that he ignored them. To put it bluntly, they were treated as nothing. From the beginning, the other party did not care about the outcome of the battle at all. The soldiers finally understood Tang In's previous words. I don't think there's a need to answer your question. Yes, there was indeed no need for him to answer. The truth was more than enough. Finally, the conversation over there ended. Tang In slowly walked over. He turned his head slightly and swept his gaze across the faces of every soldier. There was no deterrence, but everyone could not help but shrink their eyes. They subconsciously turned their heads away. I heard that you're all elites selected from various armies? His tone was calm, and there was a hint of suspicion. The faces of the soldiers turned red. They were even more ashamed. Yes, they were elites, but now they were elites who had suffered a crushing defeat. Old Marshal Omeng isn't playing with me, is he? Shaking his head, Tang uncurled his lips and revealed a mocking smile. In my opinion, you don't even look like soldiers. The soldiers were stunned for a moment. Then, they raised their heads and looked at Tang In angrily. They were prepared to be mocked, but no matter how much they were mocked, they couldn't deny that they were soldiers. This had nothing to do with face or dignity. Still not convinced? Ha! Tang In sneered and said, even if you've been a soldier for a day, you should know to obey your superior's orders. Previously, you were scattered at the various points of the hill to intercept them, right? Then why did you come out of hiding so easily and take the initiative to attack us when we passed by? It's all because you were lured in. This was the first thought that came to many soldiers' minds, but they couldn't say it out loud. This was because they knew what they were thinking. The people from the Gray Space were too arrogant. They couldn't wait to slap them in the face. Moreover, they all believed in their own abilities, so they acted alone. What a joke. You don't even know how to obey your superior's orders, and you still have the nerve to call yourself a soldier? TSK, elite soldiers. To be honest, the fact that you're still alive now is the biggest joke the God of Light ever made. Titan's expression changed. He glanced at Tang In, then quickly looked away. As if he wanted to explode with all the mocking words he had said earlier, Tang In's words were now very spicy and thick. Of course, he wasn't doing this just to attack these soldiers. He was also vaguely paving the way for Titan to establish his authority as a platoon leader. After bypassing this intention, Tang In didn't show any mercy. His face was full of disdain. What a pile of trash. Perhaps what you said earlier was right. I'm not qualified to be your instructor. Well, only trash pits are qualified. And you're still talking to me about tactics. You're simply insulting the word. With your standards, any of the 3 major legions captains can kill you in seconds. The people I taught were easily killed. TSK. Why don't you let me kill you first? Sorry, because I really can't afford a lose face like that. I really don't understand what the officer who chose you was thinking. Did he accept money? Trash is trash. No matter how much you modify them, they're still trash. Don't you understand that? Silence. Complete silence. David and the others stayed under the tree. They looked at each other and couldn't help but raise their eyebrows in surprise. They had been ridiculed a lot during their training before, but it wasn't as bad as this. In the end, they could only sigh. It seemed that Boss's ability to ridicule people increased with his strength. If the gray space was like this, the soldiers' feelings were even more obvious. At first, their faces were burning, but then they gradually became numb. In the end, it wasn't just their faces that felt a little numb. Even their brains felt an inexplicable numbness. They clenched their fists, their breathing became heavy, and the blood vessels on their necks pulsed from time to time. Other than humiliation, another emotion called anger was also increasing. However, although their anger level was close to breaking through the limit, they couldn't erupt. The reason was simple. The truth was right there. They had lost, and the losers naturally had no right to ask for anything from the winner. They could only stand there stiffly and endure the ear-piercing trash title that came from the left and right. The sarcastic ridicule lasted for nearly a quarter of an hour. In the end, Tang In suddenly waved his hand and said, "Forget it. There's nothing to talk about with trash. It lowers my IQ. Sigh, you can know anything, but not a favor." Scratching his head in annoyance, Tang In turned around and waved his hand. "Today's training ends here. Dismissed. Gather at the South Gate at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. Latecomers will be considered as forfeiting. Of course, you can also not come. Just like that person, yes, you can simply withdraw. It's best if none of you come. Not coming? What kind of joke is this?" The soldiers gritted their teeth. Their faces were cold. Then, they collectively gave a standard military salute. Don't misunderstand. This salute was not a compromise. There wasn't even the slightest bit of respect in it. They just didn't want to be caught by someone in this area. If the soldiers were silent because of the crushing defeat and humiliation before, then now they were suppressing the anger in their hearts. They were waiting for the day when they defeated the gray space to completely explode. Taitan, who was the last to leave, nodded at Tang Un to express his gratitude. He didn't say anything and followed the soldiers down the mountain. He understood Tang Un's intention to provoke them. At this time, he was a squadron leader. Naturally, it wasn't appropriate for him to stay and reminisce with the others. "All right, pack up. You guys can go and participate in the training." It was already noon. In a little while, it will be the time to meet with Zwafan. "A boss." David carefully came up. "We won't be treated like this later, right?" Tang In was stunned. Then he laughed. "How is that possible? You want someone with a speech impediment to reprimand you." Wait a minute." Tang In's expression quickly turned serious. He looked at everyone and said, "All of you, remember, whatever Zwafan says or signals, just do as he says. No one is to say anything unnecessary, especially David. You're not allowed to speak." Why?" David touched his hair and asked in confusion. "Don't ask too many questions. If you want to live for a few more years." Tang In said solemnly again. To be honest, he was also a little worried. As an instructor, the most he could do was scold some harsh words. Even if he had to fight, he wouldn't kill anyone. However, it was hard to say for Zwafan. Once he came into contact with the forbidden area, an unintentional slash from his sword would definitely wipe out the entire army. Damn, the more I think about it, the more I feel like I invited the wrong person. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 299. There was a small area in the east of the encampment. It was originally used to store rocks and logs, but as the construction of the city wall progressed, the materials were transported out and finally formed this empty space. Although Zwafan agreed to be a teaching assistant, his main task was to protect Rosa. Therefore, he could only teach in this area. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Zwafan appeared on time. "Hi, good afternoon. Tang En waved his hand and greeted him first. Tang En used blood energy, which had little to do with battle energy, so he didn't come here to secretly learn. His main purpose was to be a translator. With Zhou Fan's personality, if David and the others couldn't understand his intentions, they could just stare at each other until the end. Of course, he would also supervise them. Not Zhou Fan, but David and the others. It wasn't easy to create the gray space. Tang En naturally didn't want to be killed because of a random reason. Zhou Fan nodded in response, and then looked at David and the others who were nervous and excited. Although they had received the news and were excited for half a day, they still couldn't believe it. When Zhou Fan stood in front of them, David and the others couldn't help but feel like they were dreaming. The personal teaching of a void-level warrior, this kind of opportunity, even normal nobles wouldn't be able to enjoy. But they were commoners, and some of them hadn't even trained for a long time. Yet they got it, cough, cough. Tang En cleared his throat to wake everyone up. He said straightforwardly, "Everyone, show me your battle energy. I'll go first." David stepped forward and opened his mouth to speak, but when he saw Tang En's glare, he subconsciously closed his mouth. Then he laughed and raised his fist, about to release his battle energy. At this time, Zhou Fan suddenly raised his hand and drew a pale golden shield in the air. It looked like a shield. "Here." David opened his mouth and was a bit confused. He turned to look at Tang En. "Idiot, use your battle energy to hit this." Tang En touched his forehead and couldn't bear to look at it. "Oh." David touched his hair embarrassedly. Then his expression became serious and he roared. Yellow battle energy gathered on his fist, and he directly smashed it at the pale golden shield. There was no sound. After the fist came into contact with the pale golden shield, it was instantly repelled by a gentle force. Then it was like a stone falling into a lake. Ripples appeared on the water surface. Zhou Fan raised his eyebrows as if he was surprised by something. Then he looked at Michaud. A few minutes later, dozens of people finished the test. In the gray space, David's battle energy was the strongest. He was an advanced beginner warrior. He had been stuck here for some time. Then it was Michaud's turn. After that, they were all novice martial artists. The weakest one among them had only just started to feel Do Chi. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Only after a few punches on the pale golden shield did Do Chi appear. At this time, Zhou Fan's eyebrows were completely raised. He didn't say anything and seemed to be thinking. Not long after, he turned his head and looked at Tang En thoughtfully. Tang En rubbed his nose and avoided it without batting an eyelid. To be honest, he was a little embarrassed. Zhou Fan's status was close to that of a void-level warrior. Teaching a group of people who hadn't even reached the intermediate level of Do Chi, if this spread out, it would be embarrassing. Zhou Fan withdrew his gaze and walked in front of David. With a wave of his hand, a pale golden gauze covered David's arm. Then, he walked over one by one and left a mark on the arm of each member of the gray space. The pale golden gauze was different in color. The only similarity was that the gauze wasn't fixed. If one looked closely, they would find that the thread-like things inside were constantly contracting and entering David's body through their pores. "Shake it off." After leaving these two words, Zhou Fan turned around and walked to a pile of logs and sat on it. This was the end of the F***CK. Tang En and David looked at each other in disbelief. "You're a void-level warrior. You can't just raise everyone's cultivation by a level with a wave of your hand, but you should at least do something similar to enlightening them with a few words. And didn't you hear? Use your Do Chi to shake it off." Tang En was the first to come back to his senses and said to everyone. As soon as he said this, colorful Do Chi flashed in the field. This wasn't because of Tang En's reminder, but because David and the others suddenly felt that the golden gauze was like a needle piercing into their arms. Although it wasn't enough to make them scream, they still couldn't avoid the pain. As soon as he circulated his Do Chi, it was effective. The golden gauze was immediately expelled. But before David and the others could breathe a sigh of relief, the gauze was like a sticky, elastic ball. It retreated slightly and then retreated in a different direction this time. Helpless, everyone could only release their do qi again. This cycle repeated, and everyone's hair stood on end as they discovered that the golden gauze seemed to have a life of its own. Not only did it automatically change the direction of the attack, it even seemed to be the other side actively avoiding it when they thought it was expelled. After Tang Yin finished speaking, he turned around and walked towards Zhuo Fan, leaving David and the others struggling with the golden veil. May I ask, what is the effect of this? At this moment, Zhuo Fan was using a small knife to pick up a piece of wood beside him. He raised his head and said, "It trains the explosive power of do qi. That light golden thing?" Tang Yin casually sat beside Zhuo Fan and asked. Perhaps it was because they were somewhat familiar with each other. Zhuo Fan nodded his head and didn't keep his words to himself. He continued to explain, battle energy is a kind of domineering power. No matter what its characteristics are, explosive power is essential. Tang Yin nodded and expressed his understanding. Just like when one first started practicing martial arts, no matter what basic things like speed and strength were essential. Zhuo Fan seemed to have seen through Tang Yin's previous indifference, so he said seriously, "This training method has been lost. It's rare now, but it's very effective." Oh, Tang Yin was completely relieved. With Zhuo Fan's personality, he wouldn't lie. Since he explained it seriously, the effect of this training method was indisputable. Moreover, different professions were like different mountains. Although Tang Yin's do qi wasn't as exaggerated as being separated by mountains, it could be considered as two parallel lines that didn't intersect. Professional work should naturally be taught to professionals. He still understood this point. It wasn't that he was narrow-minded, but that Zhuo Fan's actions were too casual. He didn't want to go through so much trouble to invite Zhuo Fan, only to receive half-hearted treatment in return. All right, since you've already taught them, do you see if there's anyone who can be trained? Ahem, taking a disciple to teach you do qi. Tang and squinted his eyes and probed. Zhuo Fan shook his head and said without hesitation, "That won't do." Is it the person that won't do? Or? Zhuo Fan rubbed his hands together, and the wooden stick that was a few inches long immediately became smooth without any burrs. He then looked at Tang Yin and said, "Do qi mantras and martial arts techniques belong to my sect. Without permission, they can't be taught to outsiders." After a pause, he continued, "Actually, this method of training explosive power is the same. It's just that you guys can't learn it, so I used it." Understood. Tang Yin nodded and didn't mention it again. He just suddenly thought of it and casually mentioned it. He didn't have much confidence in it. Regardless of which world it was, mantras and martial arts techniques were extremely important. It was normal to keep them to oneself. This was because the aspects involved were too sensitive. If the enemy obtained your mantras and martial arts techniques, you would naturally be at a disadvantage in battle. After bypassing this, the following conversation was very boring. TSK, why is the difference so big? You taught it so easily, but I had to work so hard to teach those soldiers. You're sculpting? You've already put it into practice. Let me see, what are you sculpting? I can't tell. I haven't started yet. Oh, then what are you going to do? Hey, don't go. Trust me, I'm a professional. I'll give you some good advice. 2 hours quickly passed by with Tang Yin and David chatting. Of course, it was mainly Tang Yin who was talking alone. Zhuo Fan was focused on sculpting something and turned a deaf ear to the outside noise. David and the others obviously didn't think so. During this period of time, every second felt like a year. Although the light gold gauze looked like a thin layer, its resistance to fighting spirit was top-notch. They couldn't even expel the golden fighting spirit from their bodies, let alone shake it off. Moreover, this stupor was far from over. After 2 hours, Zhuo Fan casually said that the fighting spirit would disappear before dinner and simply turned around and left. This made David and the others completely dumbfounded. Damn, it wasn't over yet? Tang Yin obviously wouldn't plead for mercy. In fact, after he knew how rare this training method was, he was already thinking about adding more training. Now that Zhuo Fan was doing it, he naturally couldn't wait. After Zhuo Fan left, he didn't walk far. After turning a few corners, he arrived at Rosa's house. He directly pushed the door open and entered. Inside the house, Rosa was discussing something with a few middle-level managers. Everyone glanced at him and then looked away. They seemed to be used to this and didn't seem to be interrupted at all. Zwafan also didn't look sideways. He directly walked to a corner behind Rosa and sat down cross-legged, returning to his non-existent state. Half an hour later, the few of them finished their discussion and left. Then another group of people came in and the discussion in the house started again. They came and went until evening. Finally, Rosa's house returned to normal. Stretching his back, Rosa pinched the bridge of his nose and temporarily got rid of the tiredness on his face. He then picked up a stack of papers and flipped through it a few times. Suddenly, he said, "How does it feel to teach someone for the first time? How about the gray space?" Although this question was asked suddenly and without turning around, there were only two people in the house. Naturally, it was obvious who he was asking. "I don't feel anything." The calm voice paused for a moment. Zwafan frowned slightly and lowered his head to think. Then he said, "The gray space is very strange, very powerful." HM? Rosa stopped flipping through the papers. After a moment, he put down the papers and turned around. "To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 300. To be able to get such an evaluation from you. It seems like the gray space is not bad. Luo Sha was not lying. Although she and Zwafan had no problem communicating, Zwafan was a blockhead, and the two of them did not have many opportunities to talk. Even so, she naturally knew that Zwafan's style of speaking was pragmatic, but could also be described as inflexible. Moreover, people who didn't like to talk often used fewer words to express more. Zwafan was like that. Now that he used very strange, very powerful, these two words with emphasis meant that he was really shocked by the gray space. "I'm a bit tired." Rosa bent her arm and stretched it to hit her shoulder and back. Zwafan's eyes flashed and his fingers trembled. But in the end, he calmed down. Rosa tilted her head and a trace of disappointment flashed across her face. She smiled and said, "Tell me more about it. How is it strange and powerful?" Zwafan nodded and sorted out his thoughts. He said, "Their overall cultivation level is average. The highest is only at the peak of the beginner level. The others are mostly warriors." Oh, hearing this, Rosa was even more surprised. She could not believe it. How is it possible that they are so weak? It was no wonder that Rosa was so surprised. In a different world, the most direct way to judge a person's strength was through their cultivation level. Although there were some talented people who could defeat their seniors, the probability of that happening was very low. Looking at the Gray Space's battle record, they won every battle. It was extremely beautiful. Such an impressive performance was achieved by a group of people who had not even reached the intermediate level. Could it be that they were all talented martial arts geniuses? Of course, Rosa did not know that David and the others were just ordinary youths. Otherwise, she would be shocked by the speed of their cultivation. Their talent is average. Although there are a few who are not bad, most of them are mediocre. Zwafan was very familiar with Rosa. He knew what she was thinking just by looking at her expression. He shook his head and denied it. "Oh, that is interesting." Rosa nodded and signaled for Zwafan to continue. "That is not the only interesting thing." Zwafan furrowed his brows. He was a little puzzled. What's strange is that even though their strength is average, the explosive power of their Do Chi and their actual strength are unexpectedly good. It's so good that it's even better than their previous level. Zwafan seemed to be worried that Rosa wouldn't understand, so he explained, "For example, David's combat power is at the peak of a beginner warrior, but the combat power he uses is comparable to that of a beginner warrior." Rosa nodded to show that he understood. Then he asked, "Is everyone like this?" "Yes." Zwafan nodded. Rosa tilted his head back slightly. His face was full of shock. "If everyone is like this, then it must be because of Tang En. Can't you see the reason? If that was the case, Wouldn't they be able to fight against the Earth rank once they reach the advanced rank? When you reach Earth level, you can fight with space level. The more Luo Sha spoke, the more excited he became. However, Zhuo Fan quickly interrupted him. It's not that simple. Shaking his head, Zhuo Fan guessed. They must have used some special technique, but it's impossible for them to continue like this. The boundary between beginner and intermediate is easy to cross, but the higher you go, the harder it is. It's like how the extra water from a ravine can fill a pond, but it can't cover a lake, not to mention the river and sea. That was the logic. Zhuo Fan's analogy was very accurate. Rosa suppressed his excitement. He nodded in understanding, then sighed. His face was full of disappointment. Of course, if Tangen was here, he would also agree. The reason why David's combat power was like this was because it went through the meridians in their arms before it was released. Even though Tangen did not understand this, Zhuo Fan's explanation sounded very convincing. As for Tangen, Zhuo Fan's brows furrowed. He hesitated. I can't see through him. I've seen him fight before. Compared to his combat power, he seems to trust his body movements more. Even if his opponent is a low-level warrior, he rarely uses his combat power. Basically, he doesn't use it if he can. Of course, a person's strength and speed are very important. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that they are the foundation. But the key is that there will always be a limit. Combat power is the foundation of strength. But then again, Tangen does have the ability to do this because his physical attacks are very effective. And maybe he's doing this because he hasn't reached his limit yet. Zhuo Fan's tone was full of admiration. Everyone who practiced martial arts would go through strength, speed, and other basic training. But basically, all warriors would give up on this and turn to training their combat power after they reached a certain level of foundation. One of the reasons for this was that once one's strength and other basic attributes reached a certain level, it would be very difficult to increase even a little bit. Secondly, it was undeniable that combat power was much more powerful than strength. What Zhuo Fan admired was that Tangen didn't give up on the boring and difficult basic training. Bit by bit, he pushed himself higher. Hitting a bottleneck in martial arts was like hitting a boulder on a mountain path. Some people would immediately change paths or continue to chisel for a while. However, there was a type of person who would quietly and attentively wield their tools. Inch by inch, they would chisel down endlessly. All those Zhuo Fan admired this spirit. He wasn't optimistic about the future. This was a common concept from a different world. Combat power was definitely stronger than physical strength. In other words, even if Tangen could rely on these advantages to become invincible among those of the same level, wouldn't it be better if he put all his energy into training his combat power? Of course, if Tangen knew what Zhuo Fan was thinking, he wouldn't know whether to laugh or cry. How could he not use anything? Blood energy was different from combat power. He didn't dare to use it, or it could be said that he had to use it carefully. As for physical training, it was the old housekeeper's request. He just followed it out of habit. Moreover, Tangen should have a way to hide his strength. After Zhuo Fan pondered over Tangen's basic training, he continued. In front of a high-level warrior, the strength of a low-level warrior can be seen as soon as they fight. But Tangen, how should I put it? If you see him using the strength of a middle-level warrior, then his strength is at the middle level. But after he fights with a high-level warrior, you will find that his strength is at the high level again. If that's the case, is he a high-level warrior who is hiding his strength? Luo Sha blinked and asked in confusion. It's certain that he is hiding his strength, but his strength should be at the peak of the high level. Maybe it will be higher in a real battle. Zhuo Fan hesitated for a moment, then shook his head and sighed. Actually, rather than saying that he is hiding his strength, it is better to say that every step he takes is very steady. His use of strength has reached a subtle level. According to his personality, this should be the case. Obviously, Zhuo Fan thought that Tangen's attitude towards combat power was the same as how he trained his body. Steady and persistent. Hiss. At this point, there was a bit of silence in the room. Luo Sha took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. Her face was full of respect and solemnity. She understood Zhou Fan's words and also thought of Tang An's vision of democracy and freedom. Obviously, she thought that Tang An must have read a lot of books in this area and had enough experience. Then, with the conclusion of his daily thinking, outstanding talent would make people feel amazed and envious, but great perseverance and determination would make people feel admiration. Of course, Luo Sha and Zhou Fan didn't know that all of this had turned into a huge misunderstanding because of their initial wrong judgment. After a while, the silence in the room was broken by Luo Sha. "Oh right, you said that it was strange. What about the strength?" "That's easy to think about." Zhou Fan seemed to have thought of something and nodded. "The strength of the gray space is not high, but it can achieve such results. Of course it is strong." "Ha, that's true." Luo Sha chuckled and rolled her eyes. "But there should be a reason for this." Is it because of their strange combat power?" "Not entirely." Zhou Fan narrowed his eyes. "Although their combat power is not weak, with just a few dozen of them, they can't paralyze a regiment. When I said they were strong, I was talking about their way of doing things, their style. It's more appropriate to say that they are creative in fighting. In this aspect, they are obviously at a higher level than ordinary soldiers and martial practitioners. What's more interesting is that they are not alone. If they're combined into a team of 2 or 5 people, their power will be even stronger. This is a team where 1 plus 1 is more powerful than 3. This is the reason why they can defeat a regiment with just a few dozen of them." These words were said lightly and seemed to be a simple team cooperation. However, only the people involved knew how difficult it was. It was not easy to cooperate in a battle. It should be known that the relationship between people was not only about complementing each other, but more often than not, they would drag each other down. This was also the main reason why old Marshal Omeng didn't hesitate to agree to cheat and invited Tang An to teach those elite soldiers. It seems that this Tang An is really a guy full of treasures." Luo Sha rubbed her palms and smiled. Without a doubt, they all knew that this style and technique must have been brought into the gray space by Tang An. Zhou Fan didn't respond, but his expression showed that he agreed. After Luo Sha praised him, she pretended to be depressed. "It's a pity that this guy is lazy. It's really hard to get him to do something." This was not wrong. Other than Josiah, Tang An basically only did things that were beneficial to the gray space. As for the other things, they were only things that he owed a favor to and had to do. It had to be said that no matter how much Tang An resisted or rejected it, the assassin system had indeed changed his personality. "All right, it's getting late. You should go and have dinner first. Bring me some too." Looking at the sky outside the window, Luo Sha lit the oil lamp and continued to pick up the stack of papers. "Okay." Zhou Fan stood up silently, but his steps were a little hesitant. Behind Luo Sha's back, Zhou Fan's usually calm face was filled with nervousness. Zhou Fan squeezed the hilt of his sword and walked around Luo Sha's desk faster than usual. He waved his sleeves and walked out of the door even faster than usual. Luo Sha didn't notice Zhou Fan's strange behavior. In fact, unless they met face to face and had something to say, no one would pay attention to Zhou Fan. After a quarter of an hour, the oil in the oil lamp was almost dried up. The light emitted by the flame also dimmed. Luo Sha rubbed her eyes and moved the oil lamp closer. Suddenly, her hand paused. She blinked and then blinked again. At the corner of the table, there was a dark brown wooden statue. It looked like a squirrel, hugging its paws and looking cute. Of course, Luo Sha knew that there were no decorations on her desk. There were only piles and piles of reports. He was stunned. Who gave it to him? Luo Sha's face froze. This thing wasn't there when she took the reports. During this time, who else was there? Okay, she opened her mouth and made a sound. Then, the sound became louder and louder. Stupefaction, disbelief, dizziness. All kinds of expressions, all kinds of emotions. Luo Sha's face became blurry under the dim light. Then, her body sank into the shadows. In the silent room, he stared at the squirrel without moving, as if he was a human-shaped statue. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. That you're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.